Beneath the endless green canopy of the Amazon, scientists are finding something that should not have been there: ancient roads, dark, human-made soils, geometric earthworks, and traces of settlements that may have once supported millions of people. For centuries, the rainforest was imagined as untouched wilderness, too dense and too poor in soil for great civilizations. But the forest was hiding a different story. This was not an empty world. It may have been one of the largest inhabited landscapes in the ancient Americas. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because the real mystery is not only how so many people lived in the Amazon, it is how a civilization that vast could vanish beneath the trees. At first, there is only green, green above, green below, green pressing in from every direction, a living wall of leaves and vines and trunks so dense that even sunlight seems to enter carefully, in thin, broken pieces. From the air, the Amazon looks almost endless, a breathing continent of forest, mist, rivers, and shadow. It looks ancient in the simplest possible way, as if it has always been this way, as if human beings could only ever pass through it briefly before being swallowed back into the leaves. For generations, that image shaped the way the outside world imagined the Amazon: beautiful, dangerous, immense, and empty. A wilderness too wet, too tangled, too poor in soil to support anything larger than scattered villages and small wandering bands. Then the forest begins to give up shapes. Not through temple towers rising above the canopy, not through pyramids of cut stone, not through ruined palaces waiting in plain sight. The Amazon does not reveal its past that way. Its clues are quieter, flatter, easier to miss. A raised road running straight beneath the trees, a ditch cut into the earth in the form of a circle, a dark patch of soil richer than the land around it, a cluster of mounds where seasonal floods once rose and fell, a pattern of useful trees growing in places where chance alone seems too weak an explanation, from satellites, from aircraft carrying LiDAR scanners, from careful excavations in fields and forest edges. A different Amazon starts to appear, one that does not look empty at all. It looks inhabited. And not only inhabited in a modest or temporary way. What scholars now debate is not whether ancient people shaped the Amazon. That question has largely changed. The harder question is how deeply they shaped it, how many lived there, how organized their societies became, and how much of what appears to be untouched nature is actually a memory of human design. Some estimates suggest that before European contact, the greater Amazon may have supported millions of people, perhaps as many as 10 million across its many regions. The evidence remains incomplete, and no single number can be treated as certain. But the old idea of a nearly empty rainforest has been badly shaken. Beneath the modern canopy lies the outline of a human world so large that for centuries it hid in plain sight. The mystery is not simply that people lived in the Amazon. People have lived there for thousands of years. The mystery is that a landscape once dismissed as incapable of supporting dense societies now appears to contain roads, earthworks, engineered soils, ceremonial spaces, managed forests, and traces of settlements that belong to many different cultures across an enormous area. It is a civilization story without the familiar costume of civilization. There are no marble columns, no crumbling colosseums, no desert tombs glowing under a clean, dry sky. The Amazon's architecture was often made of earth, timber, thatch, gardens, canals, and living plants. It was built in materials that rot, flood, burn, and return to soil. Its ruins did not stand above the forest. The forest grew through them, over them, and in some cases because of them. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The deeper story begins with a mistake of scale. To an outsider moving through the rainforest after centuries of collapse, the Amazon could seem like a place where nature had won completely. The trees were too vast, the heat too heavy, the insects too relentless, the rivers too powerful. European explorers, missionaries, soldiers, and later scientists often looked at the surviving indigenous communities and assumed they were seeing a timeless picture, as if life there had always been sparse and small. But they were often seeing the aftermath. They were seeing societies after epidemics had moved faster than armies, after trade networks had broken, after villages had emptied, after survivors had fled deeper into forest or regrouped in new ways under unimaginable pressure. That is one of the central reversals in this story. The Amazon was not empty because it had always been empty. In many places, it may have appeared empty because catastrophe had already passed through. The catastrophe did not leave a single smoking crater. It did not create one famous ruin where the last king fell. It unfolded unevenly, across rivers and tributaries, through disease, enslavement, warfare, missionization, displacement, and the collapse of exchange systems that once tied distant communities together. By the time many later observers arrived, they were not looking at the Amazon before history. They were looking at the Amazon after a historical disaster so deep that the forest itself helped hide the wound. And the forest is very good at hiding wounds. In dry lands, a city can die and still leave a skeleton. In the Amazon, abandoned clearings close quickly. Wooden houses collapse, thatched roofs vanish. Paths become root corridors, plazas become groves, ditches fill with leaves, mounds soften at the edges, pottery sherds sink into dark earth. The rain does not preserve a human landscape the way desert air can. It edits it, it blurs it, it covers the evidence with life. The result is strange. One of the largest possible human transformations of the ancient world may have been concealed not by sand or ice, but by abundance. For a long time, the argument against large Amazonian populations seemed simple. Rainforest soils, especially away from fertile floodplains, are often thin and heavily leached. Nutrients are locked in living vegetation, not stored generously in the ground. Cut the forest, plant crops, and without careful management the soil can weaken quickly. To many scholars, this seemed to set a hard limit. Dense societies, they assumed, needed grain fields, domesticated animals, ploughs, irrigation, and surplus in a form that looked familiar from Eurasia, Mesoamerica, or the Andes. The Amazon appeared to lack the foundations. But the people of the Amazon were not trying to build Mesopotamia under the trees. They were solving different problems with different tools. They learned rivers, fish migrations, flood cycles, forest edges, palms, fruits, tubers, fire, compost, charcoal, and soil. They learned how to live with water instead of merely against it. They learned that a forest could be managed without becoming a field, that abundance could be spread through trees, gardens, orchards, fisheries, and wetlands. What survives in the record suggests not a single empire with one capital, but a mosaic of societies that shaped the land in ways outsiders were slow to recognize, because those ways did not match the expected image of civilization. This is where the phrase lost civilization becomes both useful and misleading. It is useful because something vast was lost: populations, settlements, languages, political systems, ritual places, and knowledge of landscapes that had been cultivated over generations. It is misleading because these worlds did not vanish into nothing. Their descendants remain. Indigenous peoples across Amazonia continue to carry histories, practices, ecological knowledge, and relationships with the forest that reach far deeper than written colonial records. The loss was not total, and the people were not some vanished species from another age. The mystery is not that they disappeared completely. The mystery is how much of their world was erased from outside memory while remaining embedded in the land itself. The number 10 million hovers over the story like a challenge. It is not a simple fact carved into stone. It is an estimate, part of an ongoing debate about carrying capacity, settlement density, archaeological visibility, and the scale of post-contact collapse. Some scholars argue for lower numbers. Others point to the growing evidence of dense occupation in multiple regions and argue that older estimates were far too conservative. No single explanation fully accounts for all the evidence now emerging. Yet even if the highest numbers are revised, the direction of the discovery is clear. The Amazon was not merely a backdrop for small human groups. In many places, it was a built and inhabited world. The first shock comes from seeing order where chaos was expected. In parts of the Upper Singu, researchers have documented planned settlements connected by roads, with plazas and defensive ditches arranged across the landscape. In Acre and nearby regions, geometric earthworks appear beneath areas where forest has been cleared, their circles and squares cut into the ground with a precision that suggests organized labor and shared meaning. In Bolivia's Llanos de Mojos, raised fields, canals, causeways, and forest islands show how people transformed seasonally flooded savannas into productive landscapes. On Marajó Island, near the mouth of the Amazon, large mound-building societies once flourished in a watery world of channels, wetlands, and estuaries. These are not identical societies. They did not all speak the same language, follow the same rituals, or organize power in the same way. That matters. The Amazon's ancient past was not one hidden kingdom waiting to be named. It was many worlds, adapted to many environments, rising and changing over long periods of time. Some were riverine, some were upland, some were built around fish and floodplains, others around orchards, gardens, and earthworks. To force them into one lost empire would flatten the very complexity that makes the discovery so important. Still, they shared one astonishing quality they made the forest historical. They turned land into memory. They left traces that were not always meant to impress strangers from a distance, but to sustain life close at hand. A patch of dark earth could be as meaningful as a wall. A stand of Brazil nut trees could be a kind of archive. A causeway across wet ground could tell of cooperation just as surely as a stone road in the Andes. A plaza cleared in the forest could hold ceremony, politics, exchange and identity even if no monument survived at its centre. So the story begins not with a city rising above the trees, but with a change in vision. The Amazon is no longer just a wilderness where civilization failed to appear. It is a place where civilization took forms that were easy for outsiders to misunderstand and easy for the forest to reclaim. The lost world is not hidden because it was small. It is hidden because it was made from living systems, and because after collapse, life kept growing. The green surface remains. The rivers still twist through it like moving bronze under the sun. The canopy still closes over old clearings. Birds still cross above ditches whose makers are gone. Roots still grip pottery fragments in the dark soil. But now, beneath that surface, another Amazon waits older, more crowded, more human, and far stranger than the empty wilderness once imagined. The first thing to understand about the Amazon is that it is not one landscape. From far above, it may seem unified by forest and water, a single green basin gathered around the greatest river system on Earth. But on the ground it breaks into countless smaller worlds. There are whitewater rivers thick with Andean sediment, blackwater rivers stained dark by decaying vegetation, clearwater rivers running over ancient shields of rock, floodplains that vanish underwater for months, uplands that remain dry when everything below becomes a mirror, palm swamps, savannas, forest islands, lakes, oxbows, beaches that appear and disappear with the season, and narrow ridges that can decide where people sleep, plant, travel, and bury their dead. Any civilization here begins by learning that the Amazon is not simply wet, it is rhythmic. The rivers rise and fall like a calendar written in water. In some places, the difference between high and low water can transform the entire world. A dry path becomes a channel, a fishing ground becomes a forest, a village edge becomes a shoreline. The flood does not merely arrive, it rearranges possibility. Fish move into flooded forests to feed among the trees. Turtles nest on exposed beaches when the water retreats. Silt settles over floodplain soils. Canoes travel where feet cannot. Then the waters pull back, and land returns changed, renewed, or sometimes damaged. To live well in such a place requires attention over generations. It requires knowing not only where food is, but when it becomes reachable, when it becomes dangerous, and when it must be left alone. This is why the image of ancient Amazonian life as simple survival misses the depth of the adaptation. People did not merely endure the rivers, they built around them. On the fertile floodplains, communities could take advantage of fish, turtles, manatees, aquatic birds, fruits, and seasonal agriculture. In upland zones, where soils were often less forgiving, people developed other strategies, relying on managed forests, garden plots, useful palms, tubers, and the gradual improvement of soil. In seasonally flooded savannas, they raised fields above the waterline and cut canals to guide movement and drainage. In regions where dry ground appeared as scattered islands, those islands became anchors of settlement, memory, and cultivation. The Amazon's river system also made distance behave differently. A place that looked remote on a map could be connected by water for people who knew the channels. Canoes turned rivers into roads. Tributaries became corridors of exchange, goods, stories, marriage partners, ritual knowledge, ceramics, stone tools, feathers, resins, medicines, and foods could move across astonishing distances. What survives in the record suggests that ancient Amazonian societies were not isolated pockets trapped in the forest. Many were part of wide networks, sometimes fragile, sometimes powerful, always shaped by the river routes that joined and separated them. The great rivers were especially important because they concentrated life. Whitewater floodplains, enriched by sediments carried down from the Andes, offered more productive soils than many upland forests. These areas could support larger and more stable settlements, and early European accounts, though shaped by misunderstanding and colonial motives, often described crowded riverbanks, abundant food, and complex communities along major waterways. Scholars still debate how literal those accounts should be taken, but they no longer seem as impossible as they once did. Archaeology has made it harder to dismiss them entirely. The riverbanks were not empty edges. In many periods, they were frontiers of abundance. Yet the Amazonian world was never limited to the main channels. Away from the great river, people learned to live in places that outsiders often assumed were too difficult for dense occupation. In the Llanos de Mojos, in present-day Bolivia, Seasonal flooding turns broad plains into wetlands. At first glance, this might seem like a poor foundation for settled life. But ancient people there reshaped the ground itself, building raised fields, causeways, canals, and mounds. Instead of treating floodwater only as an enemy, they managed its movement. Fields lifted crops above saturation. Canals could hold fish or guide water. Causeways connected settlements through wet terrain. Forest islands became centres of habitation and cultivation in a watery plain. This kind of engineering does not look like the engineering of dry stone cities, but it demanded planning, it demanded labour, coordination, and inherited knowledge. A raised field must be placed correctly, maintained, replanted, and understood within the seasonal cycle. A causeway has meaning only if people agree to build and use it. A canal changes drainage, movement, and access to aquatic resources. These features reveal societies thinking with water, not simply fighting it. In the Upper Xingu, another pattern appears. There, communities occupied a mosaic of forest and savanna, building settlements with plazas, roads, ditches, and managed spaces. The settlements were not isolated dots. They formed clusters and networks, suggesting regional planning and social ties across the landscape. The roads were often straight, linking communities in ways that imply regular movement and shared organisation. The plazas show that social and ceremonial life had spatial form. Defensive ditches suggest moments of tension, protection, or political boundaries. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points toward a world where settlement layout expressed social order. What makes these discoveries so important is that they break the old equation between civilization and stone. In the Amazon, a road could be a packed earthen avenue, a monument could be a mound, a field system could vanish under grass and forest, a city could be dispersed, with houses, gardens, plazas, orchards, and paths spread across a broad area rather than compressed behind walls. Power might not always gather into one huge palace. It might appear as control over routes, ritual spaces, fertile soils, marriage alliances, seasonal labour, and the management of food across flood and drought. Food itself was never a single story. Manioc, or cassava, became one of the great foundations of Amazonian life. But even that simple statement hides complexity. Bitter manioc contains toxins that must be processed carefully before eating, which means its use depends on knowledge, tools, and tradition. Grating, pressing, washing, roasting, and fermenting are not minor details. They are technologies of survival. A plant that could poison becomes a staple because people learn how to transform it. Alongside manioc were maize in some regions, squash, sweet potatoes, peanuts, peppers, fruits, palms, fish, game, insects, and countless forest products. The Amazonian diet was flexible, local, and often deeply seasonal. One lesser-known detail is how important palms were. To an outsider, a palm grove may look entirely natural, just another feature of tropical abundance. But palms can provide fruit, oil, fibre, building material, thatch, starch, drink, and habitat for animals. Some palms thrive around disturbed or managed areas, and their concentrations can point toward long histories of human use. The same can be true for Brazil nut trees and other useful species. The forest was not merely a pantry discovered by chance. In many places, it was encouraged, edited, and inherited. This does not mean the Amazon was an easy paradise. It was not. Floods could destroy, droughts could expose weakness, poorly managed soils could fail, insects, disease, warfare, and political conflict all shaped life there. The environment offered abundance, but rarely in a simple or permanent form. The societies that grew in the basin did so because they became experts in timing, diversity, and movement. They did not rely on one crop alone or one kind of land alone. They spread risk across rivers, gardens, forests, fisheries, and seasonal opportunities. That may be one reason the Amazonian past has been so difficult to see. Many ancient civilizations advertised themselves through concentration, the high wall, the temple platform, the royal tomb, the dense urban core. Amazonian societies often expressed themselves through distribution. Their strength lay in networks, in ecological knowledge, in the ability to draw food from many places at different times. Their landscapes were not empty spaces between cities. The landscape itself was part of the settlement. So before the story can reach the lost millions, it has to pass through water. The Amazon civilizations did not rise despite the rivers. They rose because people learned the rivers so well that water became road, field, calendar, boundary, and archive. Every flood carried risk, but also fish and silt and movement. Every dry season exposed beaches, paths, and planting grounds. Every channel connected one human world to another, long before outsiders imagined the forest as a barrier. Its people knew it as a map, and across that map, slowly, over centuries, villages did not simply appear and disappear. They rooted themselves in the pulse of the basin. They learned which soils could be darkened, which trees could be favoured, which ridges stayed dry, which lakes held fish when rivers fell, which mounds could carry a house above the flood. Out of those choices came something larger than survival. A human Amazon began to take form, shaped by rivers, hidden by rivers, and waiting for the day when the old assumption of emptiness would finally begin to crack. The idea of an empty Amazon did not begin with the forest. It began with the people who looked at the forest after disaster and mistook the silence for the original condition of the world. To them, the great canopy seemed too overwhelming to have been made historical by human hands. The trees rose like a verdict. The rivers wandered through distances that seemed beyond political control. The air was hot, wet, and heavy with decay. The soil, when cut open in many upland places, looked thin and poor. From this, an entire vision was built: the Amazon as pristine wilderness, a place where nature remained untouched because human societies had never been powerful enough to alter it. That vision was seductive because it seemed to match what later travellers saw. By the 18th and 19th centuries, many regions were sparsely populated compared with the first centuries of European arrival. Villages existed and indigenous nations endured, but vast stretches appeared unoccupied to outsiders moving along rivers or through forest trails. The apparent emptiness seemed obvious. What was less obvious was the historical violence that had helped produce it. Epidemics could move ahead of direct contact, carried from community to community through trade, flight, warfare, and displacement. A village did not need to see a European face for European diseases to arrive. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections could tear through populations with no inherited immunity, breaking families, leadership, farming cycles, ritual life, and defense all at once. This meant that many observers were not witnessing a timeless rainforest. They were witnessing the aftermath of collapse. The evidence remains incomplete, because disease leaves fewer visible ruins than fire or conquest. But the pattern is familiar across the Americas. Populations fell sharply after contact, though the exact scale varied by region and remains debated. In Amazonia, the losses were made harder to measure by the very things that made the region complex mobile communities: river networks, dispersed settlements, perishable architecture, and colonial records that were uneven, biased, or absent. Still, the basic point is difficult to avoid. The forest that many outsiders called untouched had already been touched by catastrophe. The myth of pristine wilderness also grew from a misunderstanding of what human influence looks like. In Europe, the Near East, or parts of Asia, centuries of cultivation often produced open fields, terraces, pasture, walls, roads, and towns that clearly separated the human from the wild. In the Amazon, human influence could look like forest. A managed grove still had leaves. A garden fallow could become a young woodland rich in useful plants. A settlement abandoned after epidemic collapse could, within decades, appear as ordinary vegetation. If people enriched soil, planted palms, encouraged fruit trees, burned carefully, hunted selectively, dug canals, or shaped wetlands. The result did not always scream human presence to an eye trained to recognize stone and ploughland, so the outsider saw forest and assumed absence. The forest was actually evidence, but in a language many could not read. Older indigenous knowledge often preserved a different understanding. Stories, place names, travel routes, sacred sites, old village locations, and practices of plant management carried memories that did not fit the fantasy of untouched nature. For indigenous peoples, the Amazon was not a blank wilderness waiting to be discovered. It was homeland, archive, cemetery, garden, battlefield, and ancestor ground. Rivers had histories, trees had uses, trails had owners, dangers and obligations. Certain patches of soil, certain groves, certain mounds, and certain old clearings could be known as places shaped by those who came before. The tragedy is that colonial science often treated this knowledge as folklore while treating its own ignorance as objectivity. This does not mean every indigenous account maps neatly onto an archaeological feature, or that memory preserves the past unchanged. Scholars still debate how to connect oral histories, linguistic evidence, archaeology, and environmental data. But it does mean the old wilderness myth was never neutral. It depended on ignoring the people who knew the forest most intimately. It also served a purpose. If a landscape is imagined as empty, then taking it becomes easier to justify. If its inhabitants are imagined as scattered remnants rather than survivors of deep historical societies, then their claims to land can be dismissed as weak, recent, or primitive. The myth of emptiness was not only an error, it became a political tool. The word pristine carries a hidden violence. It suggests purity before people, as if human presence automatically contaminates nature. But the Amazon challenges that idea. In many places, biodiversity and human history are not opposites. Useful species cluster around ancient settlements. Forest composition can reflect old choices. Dark earth patches support different plant growth. Old fallows may become rich habitats. Human disturbance, when done with long knowledge and restraint, can create mosaics rather than deserts. No single explanation fully accounts for all Amazonian biodiversity, and natural processes remain immense, but the clean division between wild nature and human culture begins to fail. One surprising detail is that some of the most natural-looking parts of the forest may be among the most historical. A grove of Brazil nut trees, towering and alive with animals, may look like untouched abundance. Yet Brazil nuts often appear in patterns that suggest human dispersal, management, or protection over long periods. Palms useful for food and materials can become unusually common near old human sites. Fruit trees may mark former villages long after houses have vanished. The forest can remember hands without preserving fingerprints. The myth also depended on a narrow definition of agriculture. For a long time, farming meant fields. A proper agricultural society was expected to clear land, plant annual crops, harvest surplus, and repeat the cycle visibly. Amazonian production often moved through gardens, orchards, managed fallows, floodplain planting, fishing, hunting, and tree crops. It could be intensive without looking like wheat fields. It could produce abundance without erasing forest cover entirely. It could shift location over time without being random or primitive. What looked like scattered subsistence might, under closer study, become a sophisticated strategy for living in a basin where too much uniformity could be dangerous. This older misunderstanding shaped archaeology itself. Researchers are human. They search for what they believe can exist. If the assumption is that large, complex societies could not develop in the Amazon, then a ditch may be dismissed, a mound undered, a dark soil patch treated as local curiosity, and a forest of useful trees seen as coincidence. For much of the 20th century, influential models argued that Amazonian environments place strict limits on social complexity. The rainforest, in this view, could not sustain dense populations for long, except perhaps along the richest floodplains. Upland societies were imagined as small and fragile. The forest became a ceiling. Then evidence kept pressing upward against that ceiling. Earthworks appeared in increasing numbers as deforestation exposed the ground. Aerial surveys revealed patterns invisible from foot trails. LIDAR began to strip away the canopy digitally, showing raised platforms, causeways, canals, and settlement layouts. Excavations revealed deep deposits, ceramics, dark earth, and signs of long occupation. Ethnobotany showed that the forest itself had been shaped by human preference. None of this proved that every corner of Amazonia was densely populated, and scholars remain careful about exaggeration. But it did prove that the old model was too small. The Amazon was not a place where history failed to happen. It was a place where history happened in forms that did not flatter foreign expectations. The myth of pristine wilderness still lingers because it is emotionally powerful. There is comfort in imagining one vast place on Earth untouched by human ambition, a green world outside history. But the truth is more interesting and more unsettling. The Amazon was not untouched. It was touched differently. Its ancient people did not simply cut the forest down to prove they existed. They entered into its cycles, altered its species, enriched its soils, raised land above water, cut roads through trees, shaped settlement networks, and built social worlds that could disappear under regrowth when disaster came. To see that clearly is not to diminish the Amazon's wildness. The forest is still immense, still alive beyond human control, still capable of overwhelming any simple story told about it. But its wildness is not the same as emptiness. A place can be full of jaguars, rivers, insects, storms, and towering trees, and still be full of history. It can be natural and cultural at once. It can be a living ecosystem and a ruined archive. That is the crack in the old vision. Once it opens, the Amazon no longer looks like a green absence. It becomes a landscape of traces. The quiet riverbank may have held houses. The dark soil may be the remains of meals, fires, broken pots, and generations of daily life. The grove may be descended from ancient planting. The mound may be an old platform lifted above floodwater. The forest does not become less mysterious when people return to the picture. It becomes more mysterious. Because the question changes from why so few lived there to how so many could live there so well, and how a world that large could fall so far from memory. Long before anyone could mistake the Amazon for untouched wilderness, people were making it answer to human rhythms, not all at once, not through a single invention, and not under one ruler commanding from a capital city, but slowly, through generations of choices repeated until they became landscape. A family clears a small garden near a stream. A village returns to the same good fishing bend year after year. Broken pottery, ash, bone, charcoal, peels, shells, and old plant matter collect in the soil. Fruit trees are spared when other trees are cut. Palms are encouraged near paths. A low place is dug to guide water. A dry rise becomes a safer place to build. Children grow up knowing which old clearing belonged to which grandparents. Over time, what began as settlement becomes memory, and memory becomes geography. This is how villages become landscapes, not by standing still forever, but by leaving marks that later generations can use. In the Amazon, permanence did not always mean a stone wall or a fixed city block. It could mean returning to the same dark soil patch because crops grew better there. It could mean maintaining a causeway across wet ground. It could mean planting useful trees whose full value would be inherited by descendants. It could mean building houses in circular arrangements around a plaza, then rebuilding them as posts rotted and roofs failed. It could mean shifting a garden outward while the old garden became a managed fallow full of food, medicine, fibres, and game. The settlement moved, but the humanized place expanded. For outsiders trained to look for permanent architecture, this kind of world could seem almost invisible. But invisibility is not simplicity. A house of wood and thatch may vanish quickly after abandonment, yet the decision to place it in relation to other houses, paths, plazas, gardens, water sources, and burial grounds can reveal social order. The Amazon's ancient communities often built with materials that returned to the forest, but they did not build without design. In regions such as the Upper Xingu, settlement patterns suggest deliberate planning, circular villages, central plazas, roads aligned toward other communities, and surrounding earthworks. These were not random camps. They were places where space carried meaning. A plaza, especially, is never just an empty area. It is a stage for the life of a community. There, people gather, process food, hold ceremonies, settle obligations, receive visitors, mark alliances, and remember the dead. A central open space tells us that social life has an architecture even when buildings rot away. Roads leading outward suggest that communities are not isolated. Defensive ditches suggest that relationships between groups may include danger as well as exchange. The evidence remains incomplete, and each region must be understood on its own terms, but across parts of Amazonia, the ground itself begins to show that ancient people were organizing more than households. They were organizing territories. The scale of that organization could be astonishing. In some landscapes, settlements were connected by straight roads or causeways that ran through forest and savanna. These routes did not simply help people walk from one point to another. They made relationships visible. They linked villages into clusters. They guided movement through space that might otherwise seem tangled or flooded. They may have carried ritual meaning as much as practical value. Because in many societies, roads are not only transportation, they are statements about connection, direction, and belonging. When archaeologists find roads beneath or within forested landscapes, they are seeing the remains of repeated movement made formal. In wetter regions, the engineering took another form. Raised mounds and fields lifted human life above floodwater. In parts of the Bolivian Amazon, ancient communities shaped seasonally flooded savannas with earthworks that could only make sense to people who knew water intimately. Raised fields protected crops from saturation. Canals could improve drainage, hold fish, or allow canoe travel. Causeways connected dry points when the surrounding plain became waterlogged. Forest islands became places where people lived, planted, buried, and returned. These modifications were not decorative, they were survival made durable. And yet survival alone does not fully explain them. Building a mound takes labour beyond one quick season. Maintaining canals and fields requires cooperation. Deciding where a causeway should run implies shared priorities. The more these features appear, the harder it becomes to imagine ancient Amazonian life as scattered families simply adapting in private to a difficult environment. Something larger is visible collective work, inherited knowledge, and social systems capable of shaping land at scales that lasted. The transformation also happened through soil. Every village changes the ground beneath it, but in parts of the Amazon those changes became especially powerful. Cooking fires, charcoal, fish bones, animal remains, human waste, plant refuse, broken ceramics, and organic matter built up over time. Instead of being washed away entirely, some of these materials created dark, fertile soils that could remain productive for centuries. These soils did not appear by accident in a single afternoon. They are the residue of long habitation, and in some cases deliberate management. A dark earth patch is a quiet ruin, but a ruin all the same. It tells of meals, fires, craft, gardens, and people staying long enough for daily life to alter the chemistry of the ground. This is one of the most surprising details in the Amazonian story. Some ancient settlements are easier to detect by the richness they left behind than by the buildings they built. A city of stone leaves walls. A village of earth and wood leaves changed earth. In a forest where ordinary soils can be poor, a patch of deep, dark earth is not a trivial clue. It can indicate where people lived densely or repeatedly, where they processed food, discarded waste, cultivated plants, and improved the land. The soil becomes an archive without pages. Gardens were another form of architecture. A garden is not just a food source, it is a planned relationship with time. Manioc may feed a household, but fruit trees feed descendants. Palms may provide today's thatch and tomorrow's drink. Useful plants placed near a house, path, or old clearing change how people move through the forest. Managed fallows blur the boundary between field and woodland. After a garden is left to regrow, it may not become ordinary forest immediately. It can become a productive zone where humans and animals both return. In this way, abandonment is not always an end. Sometimes it is part of the cycle of cultivation. This kind of land use frustrates simple categories. Is it farming or foraging? Is it forest or garden? Is a fallow wild or managed? The answer is often yes to more than one. Amazonian societies developed ways of producing food that did not always require permanent open fields. They could cultivate diversity instead of uniformity. They could embed crops in a living mosaic. They could turn old settlements into resource patches and movement corridors. What survives in the record suggests that ancient people were not merely adapting to the forest. They were making the forest more useful while allowing it to remain forest. The result was a world where human presence accumulated. A village might be abandoned after conflict, soil exhaustion, flood change, or political movement. But the place did not reset to zero. Trees remained, dark soil remained, mounds remained, paths could be reopened, stories could attach to the site. later communities might return, reuse, avoid, honor, or transform it. Over centuries, the landscape became layered with decisions. Some layers were visible, others buried. Some were remembered, others forgotten, but together they formed a human geography much larger than any single village. This is why the Amazon's ancient past cannot be measured only by counting ruins. The ruin may be the forest composition. The ruin may be a straight road softened by roots. The ruin may be a field system visible only when seen from above. The ruin may be a patch of earth that grows crops better than surrounding soil. The ruin may be a mound that looks natural until excavation reveals pottery, charcoal, burials, and old surfaces. The ruin may be a living tree whose ancestors were planted or protected by hands that disappeared centuries ago. No single explanation fully accounts for how these systems developed across such a vast basin. Different communities made different choices. Some were more settled, others more mobile. Some relied heavily on rivers, others on upland gardens or wetland engineering. Some built large earthworks, others left subtler traces. But the larger pattern is unmistakable. Human beings were not small interruptions in an untouched forest. In many regions, they were landscape makers. And as villages became landscapes became the foundation for societies that could grow beyond the scale of a single settlement. A road invites travel. A plaza invites gathering. Dark earth invites cultivation. A managed grove invites return. A canal invites maintenance. A mound invites rebuilding. Each feature pulls the future toward it. Each one makes it easier for people to stay, gather, exchange, and remember, slowly. The Amazon fills with places that are both practical and symbolic, both ecological and social. The forests still stand around them, alive and powerful, never fully controlled. But now it is no longer a wall against civilization. It is part of the civilization itself. Roots grow through old village floors. Palms rise where people once worked. Fish move through canals shaped by hands. Crops grow in soil darkened by generations of meals and fires. The line between settlement and forest softens until it almost disappears. And that, more than anything, is why the ancient Amazon was so easy to underestimate. Its people did not always build against nature. Often, they built through it. The darkest soil in the Amazon is not always the oldest soil, and it is not always the richest because nature made it that way. Sometimes it is dark because people lived there. Sometimes it is dark because fires burned in the same place for generations, because fish bones and turtle shells and plant remains were discarded beside houses, because pots broke and were left underfoot, because ash mixed with charcoal, because meals ended, gardens began, and daily life slowly changed the ground. The result is known as terra preta, dark earth, and it may be one of the most important clues to the lost human Amazon. At first glance, soil seems like a quiet kind of evidence. It does not have the drama of a buried city or the clean geometry of an earthwork seen from above. It does not immediately announce a ruler, a battle, or a ceremony. But soil is intimate. It records what people did again and again, not only what they wanted remembered. A monument can lie. A palace can exaggerate power. Soil is harder to flatter. It holds the remains of cooking, planting, burning, waste, repair, and return. In a humid forest where wood rots and roofs disappear, soil may preserve the most honest memory of settlement. Terra preta is striking because it can be far more fertile than surrounding tropical soils. In many upland parts of the Amazon, ordinary soils are acidic, nutrient-poor, and easily depleted when cleared. Yet dark earth patches can contain higher levels of charcoal, phosphorus, calcium, pottery fragments, organic matter, and other signs of long human activity. They can support crops better. They can remain productive long after the people who created them are gone. This is not a small detail. It means that ancient communities were not merely struggling against poor soils. In some places, they were creating better ones. Scholars still debate how deliberate this process was. Some dark earth may have formed gradually as a byproduct of dense habitation people cooked, burned, discarded, composted, and lived in place long enough for the soil to change. Other cases suggest more intentional management, where charcoal, refuse, and organic matter were added in ways that improved fertility. The evidence remains incomplete, and terra preta was not made in exactly the same way everywhere. But whether accidental at first or deliberate later, its existence proves something powerful. Amazonian people could transform one of the supposed limits of the rainforest into an advantage. Charcoal is central to the mystery. In ordinary fire, plant matter can vanish into smoke and ash, with nutrients quickly washed away by tropical rain. But charcoal can persist. It holds structure. It helps soils retain nutrients and water. It creates surfaces where microorganisms can live. Ancient people did not need modern chemistry to observe that soils changed around long-used hearths, middens, and burned areas. They only needed experience, memory, and the willingness to repeat what worked. Over generations, the darkening of the earth could become part of a settlement's inheritance. There is something almost haunting about this. A person plants in soil improved by grandparents they never met. A child grows up eating food from a garden rooted in centuries of discarded meals. A village feeds itself from the accumulated remains of its own past. The dead, the broken, the burned, and the eaten become fertility. In this way, terra preta is not only an agricultural clue, it is a material expression of continuity. The pottery fragments inside dark earth are just as revealing. They show that people were not only passing through. Pottery is heavy, breakable, and tied to settled or semi-settled life. Broken sherds mixed through soil suggest repeated occupation, cooking, storage, fermentation, serving, and discard. In some areas, the amount of ceramic material is immense, pointing to long histories of domestic activity. These fragments may not form a complete pot, but they form a pattern. People stayed, returned, cooked, stored, planted, and rebuilt. Dark earth also changes how archaeologists think about population. If large patches of terra preta represent long-term habitation, then the number and size of those patches matter. They become clues to settlement density. Some patches are small, others cover many hectares. Their distribution suggests that ancient Amazonian occupation was not limited to a few riverbanks or isolated camps, but caution is necessary. A large dark earth patch does not automatically mean a large population living there all at once. It may represent repeated use over centuries. A small patch may have supported more people than expected if intensively cultivated. Scholars still debate how to translate soil into human numbers, and no single formula fully accounts for the complexity. Even so, terra preta forces the debate upward. It reveals permanence where older models expected transience. One lesser-known detail is that terra preta is not simply old garbage. That description is tempting but too crude. Middens and refuse helped create it, but the best dark earths often show a complexity that suggests controlled burning, organic enrichment, and repeated cultivation. There are also related soils, sometimes called terra mulata, that may be associated more directly with agricultural fields rather than habitation areas. The distinction is debated, but it hints at a broader landscape of soil management, not just accidental enrichment under houses. The ancient Amazon may have included zones where people lived, zones where they farmed, and zones where they deliberately improved the ground over time. The importance of terra preta becomes clearer when placed against the old argument that the rainforest could not support complex societies because its soils were too poor. That argument was never entirely wrong. Many Amazonian soils are challenging, but it assumed that soil was a fixed condition. Terra preta shows that soil could be made historical. Fertility was not merely found, it could be produced. In a region where imported manure from large domestic animals was not available in the way it was in parts of the Old World, people developed other ways of concentrating nutrients: fish remains, ash, charcoal, plant waste, human refuse, shells, bones, compost, and careful burning. This also means that the ancient Amazonian food system was probably more resilient than outsiders imagined. A community with dark earth gardens near a settlement had a more reliable base for crops, combined with fish, fruit, palms, floodplain resources, and managed forest. These soils could help support larger populations. They did not solve every problem. Drought, conflict, disease, and political disruption could still devastate communities. But dark earth widened what was possible. It may even explain part of the forest's modern richness. Terra preta patches often attract later cultivation because they remain fertile. People after the original creators may reuse them, sometimes for centuries. Plants growing on these soils can differ from those in surrounding areas. In this sense, the human past continues to shape the ecological present. A farmer today may plant where ancient people once lived because the soil still carries their work. A tree may grow taller because charcoal and bone entered the earth long ago. The past does not sit sealed underground. It keeps participating. There is a quiet irony here. The Amazon's ancient people were long underestimated because they did not leave enough stone. Yet they may have left something more useful than stone soil that still feeds. A wall proves that labor was organized. Dark earth proves that life was sustained. It tells us not only that people could build, but that they could remain. Still, terra preta does not support fantasies of a single vast lost empire covering the entire basin. The evidence points instead to many histories. Some regions have abundant dark earth, others less. Some communities relied heavily on soil enrichment, while others depended more on floodplain fertility, fishing, wetland engineering, orchards, or mobility. The Amazon was never one system. It was a continent of local solutions. But across that diversity, dark earth stands as one of the clearest signs that ancient people changed the rules of the environment. The more archaeologists study it, the more the soil becomes almost like a shadow city. Not a city of walls and towers, but a city dissolved into the ground. The hearth becomes carbon, the meal becomes phosphorus, the pot becomes fragments, the house floor becomes a darkened layer, the garden becomes a fertile patch, the settlement becomes a stain that refuses to fade. And because the forest covers so much, there may be many more of these stains still unrecorded. Some lie under modern villages, some under farms, some under secondary forest, some under old orchards or near river bluffs. Each patch is a possible testimony that the land was occupied longer, worked more carefully, and remembered more deeply than the wilderness myth allowed. To stand on terra preta is to stand on the remains of ordinary life turned extraordinary by time. There may be no carved inscription beneath the feet, no king's name, no date, no triumph. But there is something more patient: the accumulated proof of fires lit before dawn, manioc processed with practiced hands, fish roasted, pots carried, children fed, gardens opened, refuse saved by accident or design, and soil made richer by living. The Amazon's lost civilization does not first speak through gold or stone. It speaks through black earth, and what it says is simple, unsettling, and difficult to ignore. People were here long enough to change the ground forever. The forest hides straight lines badly, but only if someone knows where to look. From the ground, a person can walk across an ancient ditch without understanding it. Roots twist through the slope, leaves collect in the hollow. Young trees rise from the old cut as if they belong there. The air is full of insects and birdsong, and every direction looks alive in the same overwhelming way. Nothing announces itself as a monument. There is no sign, no stone face, no standing wall. But from above, when the canopy thins or the land is scanned by instruments that can read the earth beneath vegetation, the hidden order appears: circles, squares, octagons, long avenues, paired embankments, ditches drawn with a precision that unsettles the old idea of scattered life in an untouched forest. These are the geoglyphs of the Amazon, and they are among the strangest clues in the entire story. Many have been documented in Acre and neighbouring regions of western Brazil, especially where modern deforestation has exposed shapes that the forest had kept covered. They are not drawings on stone or paintings on cave walls. They are earthworks cut into the ground itself, geometric enclosures, often formed by ditches and banks, sometimes hundreds of feet across. Sometimes linked to roads or avenues, their scale suggests organised labour, their geometry suggests planning, their persistence suggests that these places mattered for longer than a passing camp. What they meant remains uncertain. Scholars still debate whether many of these earthworks were ceremonial spaces, gathering places, territorial markers, defensive features, or some combination that does not fit neatly into modern categories. Some do not seem well suited for a permanent domestic settlement. Others appear connected to broader patterns of occupation. The evidence remains incomplete, and it may be a mistake to demand one explanation for all of them. A circle cut into the ground could gather people, mark a boundary, guide ritual movement, or express a worldview through shape. Its meaning may have changed over time. It may have meant different things to different groups. But whatever their purpose, the geoglyphs prove that people were not merely living in the forest. They were inscribing ideas into it. The shock of these forms lies partly in their contrast with the surroundings. The Amazon is famous for organic complexity, braided roots, winding rivers, layered canopies, vines, swamps, and irregular growth. Then suddenly, beneath or beside that life, there is geometry. A square in a forest is a statement. A perfect circle is not an accident of erosion. A long straight avenue is not the path a river chooses. These shapes reveal minds organising space according to principles that were social, symbolic, and technical. They remind us that ancient Amazonian worlds were not only practical landscapes of food and travel, they were also landscapes of ceremony, identity, and perhaps cosmology. The geoglyphs also expose one of archaeology's great dependencies: visibility. For centuries, these earthworks could remain unknown to outsiders because the forest covered them. In some cases, they became visible only after destructive clearing. A grim irony in which modern deforestation revealed ancient human presence while damaging the living forest that preserved it. More recently, aerial imagery and LIDAR have changed the scale of discovery. LIDAR, by sending laser pulses from aircraft and measuring their return, can digitally strip away vegetation and reveal subtle changes in ground surface. It does not magically explain the past. but it gives archaeologists a new map of possibilities. Places that once seemed featureless can suddenly show mounds, roads, ditches, canals, and platforms. This has changed not only what researchers find, but what they believe is worth looking for. Once a few earthworks are recognized, the eye becomes trained. A line seen from above is no longer dismissed immediately as modern disturbance or natural drainage. A slight rise in a field becomes worth checking. A forest edge may conceal a bank. A road may point toward a lost settlement. The land begins to look less random. Patterns multiply. Still, caution matters. Not every shape is ancient. Not every ditch is ceremonial. Not every earthwork belongs to a dense civilization. Some features may be younger, older, reused, damaged, or misunderstood. Dating them requires excavation, soil study, charcoal samples, ceramics, and careful comparison. The Amazon's humidity, biological activity, and complex land use history make interpretation difficult. Scholars must separate ancient construction from later disturbance, natural processes, and modern alterations. The mystery deepens because the evidence is real, but its meaning is not always obvious. One surprising thing about many Amazonian geoglyphs is that they may have been built in landscapes that were not exactly like the closed forest seen today. Some regions may have included more open vegetation, bamboo forests, savannas, or managed mosaics at different times. This matters because the builders may not have been cutting enormous shapes into dense, untouched jungle. They may have worked within landscapes already shaped by fire, clearing, cultivation, and natural variation. The modern canopy can mislead. It covers the past with a version of the present. In that sense, geoglyphs are not isolated puzzles. They connect to a broader Amazonian pattern, the making of visible places within living landscapes. A geometric earthwork may have stood near managed forest, gardens, paths, and settlements. It may have been approached along an avenue. It may have hosted gatherings that drew people from surrounding communities. It may have marked a sacred or ancestral place. Without written records, the exact rituals are beyond reach. But the investment of labour tells us these were not meaningless designs. People do not cut monumental circles and squares into the ground for no reason. The geoglyphs also challenge a common assumption about monumentality. A monument does not need to rise upward. It can be dug downward. In a landscape where building high with stone was not the main tradition, cutting, banking, and clearing earth could create powerful spaces. The absence of pyramids does not mean the absence of public architecture. A ditch can guide the body. An embankment can frame a gathering. An avenue can control approach. A circle can define inside and outside. The architecture is horizontal, but it is architecture. And horizontal architecture can disappear with unsettling ease. Once maintenance stops, plants return, banks erode, ditches fill, animals burrow. Rain softens edges. A place that once required collective labour becomes a shallow depression in the ground. After enough time, it may survive only as a shadow visible under certain light, or from the air, or through instruments. The Amazon did not erase these places completely, but it made them quiet. The builders themselves remain difficult to name. Archaeological cultures can be identified through ceramics, dates, settlement patterns, and material remains. But connecting a specific earthwork to a named people is often impossible. The Amazon before European contact was linguistically and culturally diverse, with communities shifting, mixing, expanding, and declining across centuries. Some earthworks may belong to societies whose languages no longer survive. Others may be connected, indirectly or directly, to ancestors of indigenous peoples living today. What survives in the record suggests continuity in some places and rupture in others. The past is not a clean map of lost nations waiting to be labelled. The meaning of the shapes may be even more elusive. Circles and squares appear simple to the modern eye, but simplicity does not mean transparency. A circle might refer to social order, the horizon, the movement of people, the shape of a village, or something entirely different. A square might organize ritual space, mark difference, or express principles now lost. Some researchers have explored alignments, orientations, and relationships to roads, but no single explanation fully accounts for the diversity of forms. The safest conclusion is also the most profound: these were built spaces of shared significance. That matters because it restores imagination to the Amazonian past without abandoning evidence. Ancient Amazonians were not only managing calories and soil, they were making places that carried meaning beyond survival. They were organizing gatherings, marking landscapes, investing labor into shapes that outlived individual lives. They were capable of abstraction, planning, symbolism, and regional coordination. In other words, they were doing what human societies everywhere do when they turn land into culture. The geoglyphs remain most powerful when seen as part of the larger hidden civilization, rather than as isolated mysteries. Dark Earth tells of residence and cultivation. Roads tell of connection. Managed forests tell of long ecological memory. Raised fields tell of water control. Geoglyphs tell of public space and meaning. Put together, these clues form a world that is neither primitive nor easily comparable to the stone civilizations better known from textbooks. It is something else, a low, wide, earthen living civilization whose monuments were not meant to survive in the way outsiders expected. And perhaps that is why they are so haunting. The circles and squares beneath the trees feel like messages without translation. They prove intention, but withhold explanation. They show that people gathered, planned, dug, and returned, but not exactly what they believed when they stood there. The forest has preserved the outline and taken back the voice. From the air, the shapes still wait. Some lie exposed in pastures, their edges visible in the sun. Others remain under canopy, known only through surveys or not known at all. More may still sleep beneath roots and leaves, not because they are imaginary, but because the Amazon is vast and archaeology has touched only a fraction of it. Every new scan risks changing the map again. Every newly recognized line makes the old wilderness seem less empty. A circle appears where chaos was expected. A road runs straight through green. A square holds its form after centuries of rain. And with each discovery, the Amazon becomes harder to see as a place without monuments. Its monuments were simply closer to the earth. To understand the ancient Amazon, the word city has to be loosened from stone. It has to be taken away, for a moment, from walls, towers, paved streets, royal tombs, and palaces rising above crowded neighborhoods. Those things are real forms of urban life, but they are not the only forms. If civilization is defined only by the materials that survive best in dry climates, then the Amazon will always seem to arrive late, or not at all. But if civilization means organized landscapes, dense relationships, shared labor, public spaces, long-distance exchange, food systems, inherited memory, and political life larger than one household, then the Amazon begins to look very different. The cities here did not always stand as cities in the familiar sense. They spread, they breathed, they blurred at the edges. A settlement might include houses arranged around a plaza, gardens behind them, paths radiating outward, managed groves, dark earth patches, fish ponds, canals, and nearby smaller communities tied into the same network. The centre might not be a stone temple, but an open space where people gathered. The road might be made of compacted earth. The boundary might be a ditch. The monument might be a mound. The archive might be soil. To an outsider expecting vertical grandeur, this could look unimpressive. To the people who lived there, it was the shape of the world. In some regions, especially in the Upper Xingu, archaeologists have found patterns that suggest planned settlement clusters rather than isolated villages. Communities were linked by roads, often arranged with plazas and surrounding earthworks. The layout implies that people shared ideas about space, direction, access, and social order. There were larger centres and smaller satellites, suggesting hierarchy or at least coordinated relationships among communities. Scholars still debate how centralised these systems were, and the evidence remains incomplete. But the old picture of scattered, disconnected hamlets no longer works. Something more organised was present. This kind of organisation may not have required kings in the classic sense. It may not have needed a palace bureaucracy, written tax records, or armies marching under banners. Power can operate through other means. It can move through kinship, ritual authority, control of marriage ties, access to fertile soils, command of labour for earthworks, knowledge of seasonal resources, or influence over exchange routes. A leader in such a world might not leave behind a throne room. Authority might be visible instead in who can gather people to build a ditch, maintain a road, host a ceremony, redistribute food, arrange alliances, or defend a settlement. This is one reason Amazonian complexity was easy to underestimate. Many classic signs of state power are either absent, perishable, or not yet found. There is no clear Amazonian equivalent of the Egyptian pyramid, the Mesopotamian ziggurat, or the Inca road empire covering mountains in stone. But absence of those things does not mean absence of social complexity. It may mean that Amazonian societies developed political forms suited to forests, rivers, and wetlands, where flexibility and networks mattered more than permanent stone capitals. A city without stone walls can still be a city if it draws people, organizes labour, shapes territory, and concentrates meaning. A plaza can be as politically important as a building. A road can be as revealing as a wall. A cluster of settlements can function as an urban network even if no single place has the density of a later European town. In the Amazon, the built environment often extended outward into ecology. The city was not separate from forest and field, it was woven through them. This can feel strange because modern minds often divide settlement and nature sharply. City here, wilderness there, building here, forest there. But ancient Amazonian landscapes may have worked more like gradients. At the centre were houses, plazas, and dark earth. Around them were gardens, orchards, useful trees, managed fallows, hunting zones, fishing places, paths, and sacred sites. Beyond those lay other communities with their own centres and territories. The transition from domestic to wild was not a hard line. It was a continuum of use, memory, and meaning. One lesser known but important point is that some Amazonian societies may have practiced forms of low-density urbanism. This is a term used in other parts of the world as well, especially where urban life spreads across broad landscapes rather than packing people into tight stone cores. Low-density urbanism can be easy to miss because it does not produce one obvious city mound. Instead, it produces networks of habitation, agriculture, roads, reservoirs, earthworks, and managed spaces over a wide area. The Amazon may have had its own versions of this pattern, adapted to tropical forest and floodplain environments. Such a city would have sounded different from a stone city. Instead of carts on paving, there would be footsteps on earth, paddles in water, insects in the heat, the thud of manioc processing, the crackle of fires, the calls of birds and people across plazas, the movement of visitors along forest roads, the splash of fish traps or canoes near river edges. Its skyline might be palms, smoke, thatch, and the dark line of forest. Its wealth might be stored not in vaults, but in orchards, soils, alliances, ceramics, featherwork, ritual objects, and knowledge of where food would appear next season. The lack of large domesticated animals also shaped this world. There were no oxen pulling ploughs through Amazonian fields, no horses carrying messengers before European arrival, no cattle herds forming the foundation of wealth, human labour, water transport, fire, plants, and local animals mattered differently. Canoes could move heavy loads along rivers more efficiently than feet could through forest. Fish could provide protein at scales that outsiders often underestimated. Manioc could feed communities if processed correctly. Tree crops and palms could distribute food through time. The city's strength came from fitting into a living basin rather than forcing it into a single agricultural mould. Of course, this does not mean the Amazon was peaceful or perfectly balanced. Ditches around some settlements may indicate defence. Settlement shifts may reflect conflict, competition, or political instability. Resource control can produce tension anywhere. Larger communities may have placed pressure on surrounding lands. No single explanation fully accounts for why some centres grew, why others declined, or how power was negotiated. It is important not to romanticize ancient Amazonian life as a flawless ecological harmony. These were human societies, and human societies carry ambition, inequality, fear, cooperation, generosity, and violence all at once. But it is equally important not to reduce them to fragile villages waiting passively for collapse. The archaeological record shows planning, investment, and adaptation. In some places, communities built earthworks that required coordinated labour. In others, they maintained roads and settlement layouts. Elsewhere, they transformed wetlands or enriched soils. These are not the actions of people living only from one day to the next. They are the actions of societies with futures in mind. The question of hierarchy remains difficult. Did some Amazonian regions have chiefs ruling over large territories? Almost certainly, in some cases. Did any develop states comparable to those of the Andes or Mesoamerica? That is more debated. Early European accounts describe powerful leaders along major rivers, abundant settlements, and organized warfare or tribute in certain areas. But those accounts must be handled carefully. Some observers exaggerated, misunderstood, or filtered what they saw through European expectations. At the same time, dismissing them entirely now seems too easy, especially as archaeology reveals that densely organized landscapes did exist in parts of the basin. The truth may lie in plurality. Some regions may have supported large chiefdoms with influential leaders and regional centres. Others may have been organised through federations, ritual networks, or relatively autonomous communities linked by kinship and exchange. Still others may have remained smaller and more mobile. The Amazon was too vast for one model. Its complexity was not uniform, and that is precisely what makes it believable. A real continent of societies is messy. It does not behave like a single diagram. Civilization, then, appears not as one lost capital but as a web of experiments. In the floodplains, people learned to live with river abundance and danger. In the uplands, they created dark earth and managed forests. In wetlands, they raised fields and causeways. In interfluvial regions, they built plazas, roads, and geoglyphs. In each case, people created forms of order that matched local conditions. Their cities were not failures because they lacked stone walls. They were different answers to different questions. And perhaps stone walls would have made less sense here than we imagine. In a wet tropical world, where rivers shift, forests regrow, and resources are distributed seasonally, a rigid urban form may not always be the best solution. Flexibility can be intelligence. Dispersal can be resilience. A network can survive shocks that might cripple a single dense capital. A managed forest can feed people while hiding the line between cultivation and wilderness. A city that looks like landscape may be harder for enemies to read, harder for outsiders to recognize, and, after collapse, almost impossible for history to remember. That is the tragedy and the wonder of it. The Amazon's ancient societies may have built worlds precisely suited to their environment, and that suitability helped erase them from later imagination, because they used earth, wood, plants, and water. Their remains did not shout across centuries, because they spread through living systems. Later observers mistook their legacy for nature alone. Because they did not fit the imported image of civilization, they were denied the word. But the word is beginning to return, changed by the forest. A city can be low, a monument can be horizontal, a road can be green at the edges, a plaza can vanish under trees and still have mattered. A civilization can leave behind not a skyline, but a pattern of soils, species, ditches, mounds, and paths. The Amazon asks for a new kind of seeing. It asks us to imagine crowded gatherings beneath open skies where forest now stands. Roads once swept clean under canopies that later closed. Gardens ripening beside houses that left only dark stains in the earth. And centres of power whose greatest architecture may have been the living landscape itself. It asks us to accept that a world can be built without stone walls, and still be real enough to lose. The number is both powerful and dangerous, 10 million. It gives the lost Amazon a human weight that scattered artifacts alone cannot carry. 10 million people means not a few villages hidden in an overwhelming forest, but a world of children, elders, farmers, fishers, potters, healers, travellers, leaders, rivals, mourners, and storytellers spread across rivers and uplands, floodplains and forest islands, wetlands and dark earth settlements. It means smoke rising from thousands of hearths. It means gardens cut and replanted, canoes moving along channels, plazas filling for ceremonies, roads worn by feet, fish drying near houses, manioc being processed before dawn, and languages carried from one settlement to another. It turns the Amazon from scenery into society. But the number must be handled carefully. It is not a census. No ancient official walked through the basin counting households and recording totals on a surviving tablet. The estimate comes from fragment settlement sizes, dark earth patches, early European descriptions, carrying capacity models, archaeological surveys, environmental evidence, and comparisons across regions. Scholars still debate the population of pre-contact Amazonia intensely. Some argue for lower totals, warning that evidence from one region should not be stretched across the entire basin. Others argue that older estimates were too cautious because they underestimated how much land had been managed, how many settlements were hidden, and how severe the post-contact collapse had been. the evidence remains incomplete, and no single explanation fully accounts for all of it. Still, the debate itself has changed. The older question was whether the Amazon could support large populations at all. The newer question is how large those populations were, where they were concentrated, and how they were organized. That shift matters. It means the argument has moved away from emptiness. Even if 10 million is treated as an upper estimate rather than a settled fact, it forces a different scale of imagination. The ancient Amazon was not a marginal human zone. It was one of the great inhabited landscapes of the pre-Columbian world. Population estimates are difficult everywhere, but the Amazon makes them especially hard. In a stone city, archaeologists can estimate house numbers, neighborhood density, and urban area. In the Amazon, houses rot. Settlements may be dispersed. Villages may move over generations. Some areas were occupied repeatedly rather than continuously. Floods erase or bury sites. Forest cover hides earthworks. Rivers eat their own banks, taking archaeological layers with them. Dark earth can show long habitation, but not always how many people lived there at one moment. A massive patch of enriched soil might reflect a large settlement, or a smaller one occupied for centuries, or repeated episodes of use. The ground tells the truth, but not always in the units modern researchers want. Then there are the early European accounts. Some 16th century travellers described dense populations along the Amazon's main rivers, with settlements stretching for long distances, abundant food, large canoes, organised leadership, and signs of conflict and trade. These reports once seemed exaggerated to many scholars because later observers found fewer people. But if disease and disruption had already devastated the river societies, then the early accounts may preserve glimpses of a world that soon collapsed. The problem is that such accounts are neither pure fiction nor pure measurement. They are filtered through fear, ambition, misunderstanding, translation, and the goals of conquest. They must be questioned, but they cannot simply be thrown away. This creates a strange tension. The earliest outsiders may have seen the Amazon at a terrible threshold, after contact had begun but before the full collapse had unfolded everywhere. Later outsiders saw an emptier landscape and assumed it was normal. Archaeology now stands between those records, trying to judge what was witnessed, what was exaggerated, and what disappeared before it could be properly described. The 10 million question lives inside that uncertainty. Carrying capacity adds another layer. How many people could the Amazon support with pre-industrial technologies? The answer depends on which Amazon is being discussed. Fertile floodplains along whitewater rivers could support higher densities than many upland areas. Wetland engineering could increase production in seasonally flooded savannas. Terra preta could improve cultivation in places where ordinary soils were poor. Managed forests could supply fruits, nuts, palms, medicines, fibers, and game. Fisheries could be enormously productive, but these resources were uneven, seasonal, and vulnerable to disruption. A population estimate that works for one region may fail badly in another. This is why the idea of a single Amazonian population number can be misleading. The basin was not filled evenly. Some regions may have been densely occupied, with settlement networks, roads, and productive landscapes. Others may have been sparsely populated or used seasonally. Some groups may have lived in large villages, others in smaller, more mobile communities. Some places may have risen to prominence for centuries and then declined before Europeans arrived. To say 10 million is not to imagine 10 million people spread like a blanket across the forest. It is to imagine a mosaic crowded corridors, engineered wetlands, managed uplands, ceremonial centres, empty buffer zones, contested frontiers, and regions where archaeology has barely begun. One surprising detail is that very high population does not always require cities that look enormous from above. In a distributed landscape, many medium-sized communities connected by roads, rivers, and shared territories can add up to a vast population without producing one overwhelming capital. 1 million people do not need to live in one city to form a complex world. They can live in hundreds or thousands of settlements woven together by exchange, kinship, warfare, ritual, and ecological management. This may be one reason Amazonian numbers were underestimated. Researchers looked for the wrong kind of density. Another challenge is the timing. Pre-contact Amazonia was not frozen in one moment. Populations rose and fell over thousands of years. Some earthworks may belong to one period, some dark earth patches to another, some settlement networks to another. A map combining every known site can accidentally create an illusion that everything existed at once. Careful chronology is essential. If a region has many ancient settlements, the question is not only how many there were, but how many were occupied at the same time. Scholars still debate these timelines, and many sites remain poorly dated. The picture is getting sharper, but it is far from complete. Even so, the accumulating evidence points toward a far more populous Amazon than the old wilderness model allowed. The number of known earthworks has grown. LIDAR and aerial surveys reveal hidden landscapes. Dark earth patches show long habitation. Forest composition suggests human influence. Archaeological work in the Upper Xingu, Marajo, Acre, the Llanos de Mojos, and other regions shows that complexity appeared in multiple forms. Early accounts of crowded riverbanks no longer stand alone. They are now part of a larger pattern. The consequences of accepting millions of people are enormous. It changes the story of the forest. If the Amazon held vast populations before contact, then the modern forest is partly a post-collapse landscape. Areas that seem untouched may have regrown over former settlements. Gardens, orchards, fields, and roads. It also changes the story of climate and ecology. Large-scale abandonment after demographic collapse could have allowed forests to expand in some regions, drawing carbon into regrowing vegetation. The scale and impact of this process remain debated, but it shows how human history and planetary systems may be linked in ways once overlooked. It changes the story of indigenous achievement as well. Millions of people could not have lived in the basin by accident. They required knowledge systems adapted to local conditions, soil enrichment, crop processing, fisheries, flood timing, plant management, travel routes, political organization, and conflict resolution. The Amazon's ancient population was not a miracle that violated environmental limits. It was the result of people learning those limits closely enough to work with and around them. And it changes the meaning of collapse. If populations were small, then post-contact decline is tragic but local. If populations were in the millions, then the collapse was one of the great demographic disasters in human history. Entire river systems would have gone quiet. Roads would have lost their travelers. Plazas would have emptied. Fields would have gone unmaintained. Dark earth gardens would have grown over. Old alliances would have broken. Languages would have vanished. Knowledge tied to particular places would have died with the people who held it. The forest did not simply cover ruins, it covered absence. The 10 million question is therefore not just about arithmetic. It is about restoring scale to lives that were minimized. It is about refusing to let the later silence of the forest erase the earlier noise of human presence. But it also demands humility. To exaggerate beyond evidence would create another myth. replacing empty wilderness with an equally simplistic lost empire. The truth is more careful and more compelling. The Amazon held many societies, some very large and complex, whose total population may have reached into the millions, possibly near the famous 10 million estimate, but with wide uncertainty. What matters most is the direction in which the evidence points. Every new road, mound, geoglyph, soil patch, settlement cluster, and managed forest stand makes the old low estimates harder to defend in their simplest form. The Amazon was not empty. It was not marginal. It was not a green stage waiting for history to arrive from elsewhere. It was already historical, already inhabited, already worked and understood at scales outsiders failed to see. The number 10 million remains suspended between evidence and imagination. It may be too high in some models, too low in others, or impossible to prove exactly. Yet it performs one useful service. It breaks the spell of emptiness. It forces the mind to fill the rivers with canoes, the bluffs with houses, the plazas with gatherings, the gardens with labour, the forest paths with movement, and the dark earth with generations. It reminds us that the Amazon's greatest lost monument may not be a structure at all, but a population millions of human lives once woven through a landscape later mistaken for silence. Once the Amazon is seen as inhabited, the forest itself begins to look different. It is no longer only a natural mass of trees closing over the land. It becomes a layered inheritance, a living record of choices made by people who planted, protected, burned, cleared, harvested, and returned. The old idea imagined two separate worlds, civilization as open land, forest as untouched nature. But in the Amazon, that division falls apart. A forest can be cultivated without becoming a field. A tree can be both wild and descended from human preference. A grove can be natural in appearance and historical in origin. The deepest traces of an ancient civilization may not be buried beneath the forest. They may be standing inside it, alive. This is the gardened forest, one of the most important ideas in understanding ancient Amazonia. It does not mean every tree was planted by human hands, or that the entire basin was one enormous orchard. That would be an exaggeration. Natural processes remain immense, and many regions were shaped primarily by climate, soils, rivers, animals, and ecological change. But the evidence suggests that humans influenced the distribution and abundance of many useful species, especially near ancient settlements, dark earth patches, river corridors, and old routes. Over centuries, people made some plants more common, moved seeds across distances, protected valuable trees when clearing, and created conditions where certain species thrived. The forest remembered. Useful trees mattered because they solved a problem that annual fields could not solve alone. A field gives food in a season. A tree gives food across years, sometimes across generations. Palms provide fruit, oil, fibre, starch, thatch, drink, and material for tools and houses. Brazil nut trees give dense nutrition and can live for centuries. Fruit trees offer seasonal abundance, medicinal plants, resins, dyes, fibres, and hardwoods tie daily life to the surrounding vegetation. To encourage such plants near settlements is to build a form of wealth rooted in time. It is not wealth locked in a treasury. It is wealth that flowers, drops fruit, shades paths, feeds animals, and outlives the people who first protected it. One surprising detail is that some domesticated or semi-domesticated Amazonian plants did not become domesticated in the way wheat or maize did. They were not always reshaped into completely dependent crops grown in uniform fields. Many remained part of a broader forest system, managed, selected, moved, and encouraged without losing their wild relatives. This creates a kind of domestication that is harder to see archaeologically. A seed does not always change shape enough to announce human control. A forest does not always become visibly artificial, but the pattern of abundance can speak. When useful species cluster around ancient human sites more often than expected, the forest begins to look like a map of old desire. Manioc sits at the heart of this world, but it does not stand alone. The processing of bitter manioc was a technological achievement, turning a toxic root into flour, bread, drink, and durable food. Yet tree crops and managed forests widened the diet and reduced risk. A household could rely on gardens, but also on palms, nuts, fish, fruit, game attracted to old fallows, and seasonal floodplain resources. Diversity was not a decorative feature, it was insurance in a region where flood, drought, pests, and conflict could threaten any single source of food. Spreading production across many species and habitats made survival more flexible. The gardened forest also changes how collapse is understood. When a stone city falls, its walls remain distinct from the fields around it. When a forest garden society collapses, the boundary between ruin and regrowth becomes blurred. Abandoned gardens become secondary forest. Protected trees keep reproducing. Old paths close, but useful species remain. Animals disperse seeds from trees once favoured by humans. A place may become less inhabited while still carrying the structure of habitation. The forest does not erase the garden, it absorbs it. This is why some modern forests may be younger, more historical, and more human-influenced than they first appear. After epidemic collapse and colonial disruption, areas once cultivated or managed could have regrown into dense canopy. Later observers saw mature-looking forest and assumed untouched antiquity. But forest can grow quickly in the tropics, and a few centuries are enough to conceal villages, fields, roads, and orchards beneath living cover. What looks primeval may in some places be post-collapse forest, rising over an older human landscape. Scholars still debate the scale of this process, and it varied widely across the basin, but the possibility itself transforms the meaning of green abundance. There is a quiet sadness in that transformation. Imagine a settlement emptied by disease, fear, or violence. The houses begin to sag, roofs leak, then collapse, paths sprout seedlings, gardens become thickets, fruit trees still bear for a time, dropping food where few hands remain to gather it. Palms continue to grow. Brazil nut trees stand for centuries. Animals return in greater numbers. The forest thickens, not as a simple victory over humans, but as a continuation of relationships that have lost one of their partners. The landscape becomes beautiful and haunted at once. Yet the gardened forest is not only a story of loss, it is also a story of survival and continuity. Indigenous communities today continue to manage plants, forests, gardens, rivers, and fallows in ways rooted in long knowledge. These practices are not relics frozen from the past, but living systems that adapt. They remind us that ancient Amazonian landscape management did not simply vanish in the 16th century. Much was broken, but much endured. The forest's human history is not only archaeological, it is also present in practices, territories, languages, and ecological knowledge that remain alive despite centuries of pressure. The challenge for archaeology is that living evidence is complicated. A useful tree near an ancient site may have been planted long ago, protected recently, spread naturally, or all of these at different times. A grove can have multiple histories. A species may cluster around human sites because people carried it, because animals liked the disturbed habitat, because soil was richer there, or because later communities reused the same place. No single explanation fully accounts for every pattern, but taken together, botanical evidence, dark earth, settlement remains, and indigenous knowledge all point in the same broad direction. The Amazon forest has been shaped by people far more deeply than outsiders once believed. This does not diminish the forest's ecological power. If anything, it makes that power more interesting. The Amazon was never a passive canvas. People could encourage certain species, but rivers still flooded, storms still broke trees, pests still spread. Animals still dispersed seeds in unpredictable ways. Succession still followed its own dynamics. Human management worked inside living systems, not above them. The gardened forest was a negotiation, renewed constantly. It required watching. Pruning, burning, planting, harvesting, sparing, and knowing when not to interfere. Such knowledge rarely leaves monuments, but it can be astonishingly precise. It includes when a fruit ripens, how a palm responds to cutting, which soil suits which crop, which animals follow which trees, how smoke affects regrowth, how to open a clearing without exhausting it, how to let a fallow become useful instead of abandoned, how to process poison out of food, and how to move through the forest without treating it as chaos. This is civilization as attention. It is not spectacular in the way a stone pyramid is spectacular, but it may be more intimate and more difficult to master. The gardened forest also forces a moral correction. For a long time, indigenous peoples were often described as living lightly in nature because they lacked the capacity to transform it. The evidence suggests something different. Many lived with forms of restraint and deep ecological skill, but not because they were incapable of change. They changed the forest in ways that often maintained productivity and diversity, rather than replacing it with a single crop. Their achievement was not absence of impact. It was a different kind of impact. Modern debates about the Amazon sometimes swing between extremes: untouched wilderness on one side, ruined human landscape on the other. The ancient evidence resists both. The forest was not untouched, but it was not simply destroyed by its inhabitants. In many places, human use and biodiversity were entangled. Managed forests could remain forests. Food production could coexist with canopy cover. A landscape could be productive without being stripped bare. This does not mean ancient systems can be copied simply into the present, or that all human use is harmless. It means the past contains examples of relationships more complex than domination or absence. The gardened forest is therefore one of the strongest answers to the 10 million question. If millions lived in Amazonia, they did not do so by forcing the basin to become something else entirely. They lived by multiplying useful edges between river and forest, garden and fallow, settlement and grove, dark earth and crop, flood and fish, clearing and regrowth. Their world was not built only in structures, it was built in relationships among species. So the lost civilization of the Amazon does not hide only under the trees, it hides partly as trees. It is in the palms that cluster where old villages stood, in the fruit species that follow human roots, in the dark soils that feed new growth, in the forest islands of flooded plains, in the old fallows that became habitat, in the plants whose abundance may reflect hands long gone. The green wall is not blank, it is written over with living signs. And once that is understood, the Amazon becomes more mysterious, not less. A ruin made of stone can be measured, photographed, and fenced off. A ruin made of forest keeps growing. It changes every season. It feeds birds, drops seeds, shades streams, and hides its own origins. It does not sit still for history. It breathes. That is why the ancient Amazon is so difficult to recover, and why its recovery matters. The civilization was not merely swallowed by the forest. In many places, it became part of what the forest is. When Europeans first entered the great river world, they did not arrive in an empty place. They arrived into motion. Canoes moved along the water. Villages stood on bluffs and river banks. Fields and orchards spread near settlements. Fish, turtle, manioc, maize in some regions, fruits, and stored food supported communities whose lives were tied to the pulse of the flood. The earliest outsiders did not fully understand what they were seeing, and their accounts are tangled with fear, greed, confusion, and exaggeration. But beneath those distortions there are glimpses of something unmistakable. The Amazon was socially alive. The Spanish expedition associated with Francisco de Orellana in the 16th century became one of the most famous of these early encounters. Moving down the Amazon River, the expedition passed through regions where chroniclers described large settlements, organized communities, abundant food, and resistance from indigenous groups who were neither isolated nor helpless. Later readers often doubted these descriptions because they did not match the emptier Amazon seen in later centuries. But that mismatch may be the point. The expedition may have moved through river societies at the edge of a catastrophe that later erased much of what had been witnessed. The accounts should not be treated as perfect windows. European chroniclers misunderstood languages, politics, and landscapes. They interpreted what they saw through their own expectations. They sometimes magnified danger to justify violence or failure. They sometimes turned rumour into fact. Scholars still debate how much weight to place on each detail, yet it is equally risky to dismiss them entirely. When later archaeology reveals dark earth, settlement networks, earthworks, and long histories of occupation, the old descriptions of populous riverbanks no longer seem impossible. They begin to sound like distorted echoes of a world that was about to break. The shockwave of contact did not move only by sword, it moved by breath, touch, trade, and time. Diseases introduced from the Old World reached indigenous communities with devastating force. Smallpox, measles, influenza, and other infections could spread along indigenous networks faster than direct European control. A disease could pass from one river community to another through travel, trade, refugees, captives, or neighbouring contact. By the time soldiers, missionaries, or later travellers entered a region, the worst damage might already have happened. They could find abandoned settlements and assume there had never been many people there. In reality, they might be seeing the empty rooms after the disaster. The human consequences were immense. A society is not only a number of bodies, it is a system of relationships. When epidemic disease kills elders, healers, leaders, farmers, ritual specialists, parents, and children, it tears holes in memory and practice. Fields go unplanted, canals go unmaintained, roads lose traffic, ceremonies stop, marriages and alliances fail, enemies take advantage, survivors flee, join other groups, retreat into less accessible regions, or reorganize around new pressures. A settlement can collapse not because every person dies, but because enough key relationships are broken that the old pattern cannot continue. Violence followed disease and intertwined with it, enslavement, raiding, forced relocation, mission settlements, colonial demands, and warfare reshaped Amazonian life. European goods entered indigenous politics. sometimes strengthening certain groups and destabilizing others. Metal tools, weapons, and trade items could become objects of desire and conflict. Missions concentrated people, which could make disease spread more easily while disrupting older settlement patterns. Colonial authorities and slave raiders targeted river populations because rivers made movement possible. The same waterways that once connected Amazonian societies became routes of invasion. This is one of the cruelest reversals in the story. The river system that had allowed exchange, communication, and cultural growth also carried collapse. A canoe route could carry food one year and infection the next. A trading partner could become a path of disease. A riverbank settlement that had once benefited from connection became exposed to every new shock moving through the basin. The Amazon's networks did not fail because they were weak. They were vulnerable because they were real. The collapse was uneven. Some communities were devastated early. Others endured longer. Some moved away from major rivers into headwaters, uplands, or more defensible areas. Some merged with neighbors. Some fought, negotiated, converted, resisted, or disappeared from colonial records under new names. The evidence remains incomplete because the colonial record was never designed to preserve indigenous histories on their own terms. It noticed what mattered to outsiders: labor, souls, enemies, resources, roots, and obedience. Entire worlds could vanish from writing if they no longer stood in the path of colonial ambition. And yet traces remain. A later traveller might pass a quiet riverbank without knowing it had once been crowded. A missionary might build near an old settlement without understanding the depth of occupation beneath the soil. A colonial map might name a region after a group already shattered by disease. A surviving community might carry a story of movement, loss, or ancestral places that archaeology only much later begins to recognize. What survives in the record suggests not one dramatic fall, but thousands of local endings linked by a continental disruption. One lesser-known detail is how quickly landscapes can change after depopulation. Fields do not remain fields in the humid tropics unless people maintain them. Open areas begin to close, secondary forest rises, fruit trees may remain, but paths disappear, canals clog, mounds soften, houses vanish. Within a few generations, a dense human landscape can become difficult for outsiders to read. This does not mean the forest erases history completely. It means history becomes harder to separate from ecology. The collapse of people becomes the growth of trees. That regrowth may have shaped not only local memory but global environmental history. Some researchers have argued that widespread population decline in the Americas allowed forests and vegetation to expand in certain regions, drawing carbon from the atmosphere and perhaps contributing in a small way to climate patterns during the early modern period. The scale of this effect remains debated, especially for Amazonia specifically, but the idea reveals how deeply human and natural histories are linked. The death of communities can leave a signal in forests. A demographic catastrophe can become an ecological event. The Spanish shockwave also altered how the Amazon was imagined. Once the densest river communities declined, later Europeans encountered societies that had already adapted to a shattered world. Some were more mobile than before. Some avoided outsiders deliberately. Some lived in smaller settlements for safety. Some concealed themselves within forest regions that had once been part of wider exchange systems. Outsiders then mistook these survival strategies for timeless simplicity. The aftermath became evidence for a false past. This misunderstanding was reinforced by colonial arrogance. Europeans often believed that civilization had to resemble their own forms of hierarchy: agriculture, architecture, and written administration. When they did not see stone cities, they saw deficiency. When they saw forest, they saw wilderness. When they saw people living in dispersed or mobile patterns, they saw primitiveness rather than adaptation after trauma. The possibility that they were looking at survivors of collapsed large societies was rarely allowed to disturb the story. But the land kept evidence that memory and writing did not. Dark earth patches remained where people had lived. Earthworks remained under regrowth. Managed species remained in forest composition. Ceramics remained in riverbank layers. Mounds stood above floodplains. The archaeological record, though damaged and incomplete, began to answer the colonial record back. It said that later emptiness was not proof of earlier absence. It said that silence can be historical. No single explanation fully accounts for the decline of Amazonian societies after contact. Disease was central, but it did not act alone. Violence, enslavement, missionization, ecological disruption, social fragmentation, and colonial economic pressure all contributed. Different regions experienced different sequences. Some societies were already changing before Europeans arrived. Climate variability, conflict, and local political shifts may have shaped earlier transformations. But contact intensified everything. It connected local vulnerabilities to a global catastrophe. The word vanished is therefore dangerous. It can make disappearance sound like a magic trick, as if millions simply faded into leaves. They did not vanish. They died, fled, adapted, merged, resisted, and survived under extreme pressure. Their descendants did not cease to exist. Many indigenous peoples of Amazonia remain, carrying histories and knowledge that colonial narratives tried to erase. What vanished was the scale of certain worlds, the continuity of many places, and the outside recognition that these societies had ever been so large. The Spanish shockwave did not create an empty Amazon from a timeless wilderness. It helped turn an inhabited landscape into one that outsiders could mistake for wilderness. That is the central tragedy. The forest that later seemed untouched may have been, in many places, a memorial growing over loss. Its beauty was real, but it was not innocent of history. Its silence was not proof that no voices had ever sounded there. Along the great rivers, the old settlements are mostly gone from sight. The banks slump and rebuild. Trees lean over water. Villages stand in new places. Canoes still move under the heat, as they have for thousands of years. But beneath some bluffs, in dark soil and broken ceramics, there are traces of the crowded river worlds early Europeans glimpsed and helped destroy. The shockwave passed through, and the forest closed behind it. Later observers saw the green surface and thought they were seeing the beginning of time. They were often seeing the aftermath. A civilization built from stone can die loudly for centuries. Its walls remain standing after its markets empty. Its temples keep their silhouettes after the prayers stop. Its roads continue to cut across hills even when no army marches on them. Travelers can stumble into the ruins and know, instantly, that people once gathered there in great numbers. The Amazon does not usually give the past that kind of afterlife. Here, collapse can be almost silent. A settlement is abandoned, and the forest begins its patient work. Roofs rot, posts soften, termites enter, vines pull down what remains, paths narrow, then vanish, plazas fill with seedlings, ditches collect leaves and water. The architecture does not stand against time, it feeds it. This is one reason the lost Amazon remained lost for so long. The disappearance was not complete, but it was visually deceptive. Societies made of earth, wood, thatch, fibre, clay, plantings, and waterways do not leave ruins in the way outsiders expect. Their remains are low, buried, living, or chemically transformed. A mound may look like a natural rise. A road may look like a faint corridor of different vegetation. A canal may look like a wet depression. A plaza may become ordinary forest. A house may leave only post holes, darkened soil, and fragments of pottery. The record survives, but it does not announce itself. Collapse without ruins does not mean collapse without evidence. It means the evidence must be read differently. Archaeologists look for stains in soil where wooden posts once stood. They study charcoal to understand fires and dates. They map slight elevations that may have lifted houses or fields above floodwater. They identify ceramics mixed through dark earth. They compare plant communities near ancient sites with those farther away. They use lidar to find shallow earthworks under trees. They study old river channels and floodplain deposits. The Amazon's past is not absent, it is subtle. The subtlety matters because it shaped centuries of misunderstanding. Later outsiders often believed that if a large civilization had existed, they would see its ruins. They expected the dead to behave like the dead of other landscapes, but the Amazon's dead cities were composting, eroding, sprouting, flooding, and becoming habitat. Their materials were not chosen for archaeologists. They were chosen by people living in heat, rain, and abundance, using what the forest gave them. Wood made sense. Thatch made sense. Earth made sense. Living trees made sense. None of these materials promised permanence after abandonment, but permanence after abandonment was not the point of daily life. A wooden house can be perfectly suited to its world and still leave almost nothing after a few centuries. That does not make it less real. A thatched roof can shelter generations and then vanish without drama. A packed earth plaza can host ceremonies, exchanges, disputes, and mourning, then disappear under roots. A city is not less inhabited because its architecture is biodegradable. Yet archaeology has often favoured the durable. Human imagination does the same. Stone flatters memory. Rotting wood demands trust in smaller clues. The Amazon also erases through excess rather than emptiness. In deserts, absence preserves. Dry air can hold a basket, a sandal, a wall, a body. In the rainforest, life rushes into every gap. Fungi, insects, roots, bacteria, rain, heat, and flood dismantle the human-made world quickly. The same ecological energy that made the forest rich made ruins fragile. The result is a strange historical imbalance. Societies that built in dry stone may seem more important simply because they are more visible, while societies that built with living and perishable materials can be dismissed as less complex. The landscape becomes an unfair archive. Floodplains add another layer of loss. Rivers in the Amazon are not fixed lines. They migrate, cut banks, create oxbow lakes, bury surfaces under sediment, and expose older layers only to destroy them. A settlement on a river bluff might be partly eaten away. A village near a channel might be buried beneath later deposits. A cemetery could be eroded into the current. The same rivers that sustain dense life could dismantle its remains. Along the main waterways, some of the most important ancient sites may already be gone, not hidden under forest, but carried away grain by grain. Fire, too, leaves ambiguous traces. Controlled burning may have helped clear gardens, manage vegetation, and create charcoal-rich soils. Later fires, colonial disturbance, modern agriculture, and accidental burning can complicate the record. A layer of charcoal might indicate occupation, field management, drought, conflict, or a combination of processes. No single explanation fully accounts for every trace. Archaeologists have to read context carefully, because in the Amazon, the same element can belong to daily life, ecological management, disaster, or later destruction. Collapse itself likely took many forms. In some places, disease emptied villages so quickly that maintenance stopped. In others, survivors deliberately abandoned exposed riverbanks and moved into safer interior zones. Some settlements may have declined before European arrival because of conflict, environmental change, political shifts, or exhaustion of local arrangements. Some were absorbed into new communities, others were transformed by missions or colonial forced labour. The evidence remains incomplete, and the word collapse can be too clean for what was often a long unravelling. But once a community stopped maintaining its built environment, the forest responded with speed. Imagine a road between villages after the people are gone. For a few seasons, it remains open enough to walk. Then grasses and shrubs creep inward. Fallen branches lie where no one clears them. Saplings take root in the centre. Animals use it as a path for a while. Then their trails wander. In a decade, the road becomes a suggestion. In a century, it may exist only as a line of altered vegetation or a slight depression found from above. The road has not vanished completely, but it has stopped being obvious. Human intention has become a pattern waiting for technology, patience, or luck. A canal can fade in a similar way. Without cleaning, sediment gathers, aquatic plants fill the channel, banks slump, floods reshape the edges. Fish may still use it, people may later reuse it without knowing its full age, or it may become a swampy line that looks natural. An engineered wetland can become ecology again, not because its human origin was imaginary, but because human engineering and natural processes continued interacting after abandonment. Mounds survive better, but even they can hide. A low mound in a vast wetland may look like a natural forest island. Trees grow on it, animals burrow into it. Later people may build on it, bury in it, farm it, or dig into it. Only excavation reveals layers of pottery, charcoal, shell, bone, house floors, or burials. A mound can carry multiple histories stacked together: original construction, later reuse, abandonment, reoccupation, erosion, and modern disturbance. It is not a frozen object. It is a long conversation between people and land. The absence of obvious ruins also made it easier for outsiders to deny indigenous land histories. If there was no stone temple, no carved inscription, no visible city wall, then the land could be described as wild, unused, or underused. This was never just an academic mistake. It had consequences. It supported colonial claims, extractive frontiers, and modern narratives that treat indigenous presence as thin or temporary. Archaeology now shows that many landscapes were occupied, managed, and inherited over long periods. The forest was not vacant because it lacked stone. One of the most revealing things about Amazonian collapse is that the forest did not simply cover the past. It sometimes preserved it by disguising it. The canopy protected earthworks from ploughing in places where modern agriculture had not yet reached. Roots held mounds together. Regrowth kept some sites from being destroyed by exposure. The same vegetation that hid the evidence could also shelter it. This creates another irony. Destruction of the forest has revealed many ancient sites. But continued destruction may erase them forever. The past becomes visible at the moment it is endangered. LIDAR and remote sensing have changed this balance, allowing researchers to detect features without clearing all vegetation. Yet technology is not enough. A scan can show a shape, but people must still walk the ground, excavate, date, compare, and listen to local knowledge. A line on a LiDAR map is a question, not an answer. It may be a road, a boundary, a ditch, a later track, or something else entirely. The Amazon's hidden civilization is not being discovered in one dramatic revelation. It is being assembled through thousands of careful acts of recognition. The deeper lesson is that ruins are not the only measure of history. A civilization can collapse into soil rather than rubble. It can leave orchards instead of columns, charcoal instead of inscriptions, roads that become shadows, and settlements that survive as fertility. It can disappear from the eye while remaining in the ground. The plants, the river names, the memories of descendants, and the patterns of the land. The Amazon forces history to become less dependent on spectacle. This does not make the loss smaller. If anything, it makes it more haunting. Stone ruins dramatize absence because they hold empty space open. Amazonian ruins often do the opposite. They fill in. They become green, fertile, alive. They hide the emptiness by growing over it. A plaza where people once gathered may now be dense with trees. A canal dug by many hands may now be a wet line under leaves. A village may survive as a patch of dark earth where crops still grow well. The wound is covered not by dust but by life. And so the lost Amazon did not disappear without a trace. It disappeared without the kind of trace many people were trained to recognize. Its collapse left ruins that breathe, rot, flood, and bear fruit. It left evidence that asks for humility. The absence of stone walls was never proof of absence. It was a warning that the past had taken another form. The Amazon's lost world does not survive only in earthworks and soils. It also survives in fragments small enough to fit in a hand, a broken pot rim, a fishbone, a stone axe, a seed charred black in an ancient fire, a burial urn sealed in the ground, a post hole where a house once stood. These are quiet objects, easily overlooked beside the grandeur of pyramids or temples, but they carry the texture of daily life. They show how people cooked, stored, planted, travelled, mourned, decorated, fought, and remembered. If dark earth tells us where people stayed, and roads tell us where they moved, bones and pots tell us how they lived. Ceramics are among the most important clues because they endure when wood and fibre vanish. Pottery appears in many Amazonian regions, often in extraordinary variety. Some vessels were plain and practical, made for cooking, storage, brewing, or serving. Others were finely decorated, painted, modelled, incised, or shaped with symbolic meaning. A pot is never only a container. It belongs to a chain of knowledge where to find clay, how to temper it, how to shape it, how to fire it, how to repair or discard it, and what forms are proper for a household, ceremony, burial, or feast. When archaeologists find pottery styles changing over time or spreading across regions, they're not only seeing objects, they're seeing relationships. On Marajo Island, near the mouth of the Amazon, ancient ceramics became especially elaborate. Marajora pottery is famous for its complex designs, modelled figures, and funeral urns, reflecting societies that flourished in a watery landscape of mounds, channels, and floodplains. These were not crude remnants of marginal life. They were carefully made objects tied to identity, status, ritual, and the treatment of the dead. The people who produced them lived in a world where water shaped everything, yet they built raised mounds and created artistic traditions that still challenge older assumptions about Amazonian simplicity. Burials add another layer, though they must be treated with care and respect. In some regions, human remains were placed in urns. Elsewhere, bodies were buried in mounds, village areas, or special places. Burial practices can reveal beliefs about ancestors, community membership, social difference, and continuity between the living and the dead. They can also show health, diet, trauma, disease, and movement. But the evidence remains incomplete. Tropical conditions often damage bones. Many sites were disturbed before careful study, and burial customs varied widely across the basin. No single Amazonian death tradition existed. Still, where bones survive, they can speak powerfully. They may reveal diets rich in fish or crops, signs of physical labor, injuries from conflict or childhood stress. Teeth can carry chemical signals of what people ate and where they grew up. Ancient DNA, when preservation allows, can reveal ancestry, migration, and relationships among populations, though in tropical environments DNA often degrades quickly. Genetic evidence from ancient and modern populations suggests deep histories of movement, continuity, and diversity. But scholars still debate many details. The Amazon was never one people. It was many peoples, connected and distinct. Animal bones and shells are equally revealing. Fish remains can show which species were eaten and whether people exploited rivers, lakes, flooded forests, or managed waters. Turtle shells may point to seasonal harvesting. Bird bones, mammal bones, and shell deposits reveal hunting, gathering, feasting, and trade. These remains help correct the assumption that agriculture alone defines complexity. In the Amazon, aquatic resources could be central. A society with reliable fisheries might support dense populations in ways that look unfamiliar if one expects grain fields to be the only foundation of settled life. Plant remains are harder to preserve, but when charred seeds, starch grains, phytoliths, pollen, or residues on pottery survive, they open a window onto food and cultivation. Manioc is particularly important, though it can be difficult to detect archaeologically because the parts used and the ways they were processed do not always preserve well. Maize appears in some regions and periods, but its role varied. Squash, palms, fruits, and other plants formed part of a diverse food world. The evidence suggests flexibility rather than dependence on one staple everywhere. That flexibility may have been one of Amazonia's great strengths. A lesser-known but fascinating clue comes from residue analysis. Sometimes the inside of a pot preserves microscopic traces of what it once held. Starches, lipids, or chemical residues can hint at foods, drinks, oils, or fermented products. Such evidence is delicate and not always available, but it reminds us that pottery was part of sensory life. These vessels held heat, smell, taste, and transformation. They were used to boil, roast, ferment, store, and share. A broken sherd in dark soil may be the last trace of a meal, a feast, or a ritual drink prepared centuries before the forest closed over the site. The distribution of pottery can also reveal networks. Similar styles appearing in distant places may indicate trade, migration, shared ideas, intermarriage, imitation, or political influence. Differences in style may mark boundaries between groups or shifts in identity over time, but interpretation is difficult. A pot style is not a language. It does not always correspond neatly to a people. Objects can move without people moving. People can adopt styles without changing ancestry. The records suggest connections, but the exact nature of those connections often remains debated. Stone tools complicate the picture further. In much of the Amazon, high-quality stone was not equally available everywhere, so stone axes, blades, ornaments, or grinding tools could move across distances. A polished stone axe might represent forest clearing, woodworking, status, or exchange. Because the Amazon lacked metal tools before European contact, stone, bone, shell, wood, and fibre technologies were highly developed. The absence of metal does not mean technological poverty. It means different material solutions. Woodworking with stone tools requires skill, patience, and knowledge of both tool and tree. The archaeological record also preserves signs of conflict, defensive ditches around some settlements, trauma on bones where preserved burned layers, and early accounts of warfare all suggest that Amazonian societies were not free from violence. Competition over resources, territory, prestige, captives, alliances, or revenge could shape settlement patterns. Some communities may have clustered for defense, others may have built earthworks partly to control access. No single explanation fully accounts for every ditch or fortification, but it is clear that ancient Amazonia was not a peaceful garden without danger. It was a human world, and human worlds are rarely simple. At the same time, the evidence for exchange and shared traditions shows that conflict was only one part of the story. Ceramics, ornaments, food plants, ritual practices, and settlement ideas travelled. Rivers made contact possible. Marriage and kinship linked communities. Feasts may have strengthened alliances. Ceremonial centres may have drawn people from surrounding settlements. The same roads that could carry warriors could also carry visitors, relatives, goods, and songs. Bones and pots reveal a world of both tension and connection. One of the most important lessons from these fragments is that the Amazon's lost civilizations were not static. Pottery styles changed. Settlement patterns shifted. Foods became more or less important. Some sites were abandoned and later reused. New earthworks appeared. Old centres declined. Different regions rose at different times. This matters because popular stories often imagine a lost civilization as a single frozen world, suddenly destroyed. The real Amazonian past was longer and more dynamic. It was full of experiments, adaptations, failures, recoveries, and transformations before Europeans arrived. The fragments also show inequality in some places, though often in ways harder to read than in societies with royal tombs and monumental inscriptions. Elaborate burial urns, special objects, differences in mound size, or control over public works may suggest social distinction. But how far inequality went remains debated. Some societies may have had powerful chiefs and ranked lineages. Others may have emphasized more flexible or communal organization. Material evidence can hint at hierarchy. But without writing, the details of power are difficult to reconstruct. What survives in the record suggests diversity rather than one model. This is why every broken object matters. A potsherd is not just debris. It is a piece of chronology, technology, taste, identity, and use. A bone is not just a biological remnant. It is evidence of diet, environment, labour, and sometimes violence. A seed is not just a plant part. It is a clue to cultivation, season, and choice. Together, these fragments pull the lost Amazon out of abstraction. They make it less a number and more a lived world. They also remind us how much is missing. Countless baskets, hammocks, feather ornaments, wooden tools, musical instruments, masks, painted surfaces, and textiles have vanished in the humid air. The material culture that survives may be only a small and biased fraction of what mattered most. A society rich in song, body painting, oral history, ritual performance, and perishable craft could appear poor archaeologically if only stone and ceramic are counted. The absence of surviving objects is not the absence of culture. So the Amazon must be reconstructed from fragments while remembering that fragments are not the whole. The evidence is strong enough to overturn the myth of emptiness, but incomplete enough to demand humility. Each pot, bone, seed, mound, and soil layer adds a sentence to a book whose pages have been scattered by rain. The story can be read, but never perfectly. And yet, even in fragments, the human presence is undeniable. Hand-shaped clay and oppressed designs into wet surfaces. Teeth wore down on particular foods. Fires charred seeds. Bodies were buried with care. Fish bones accumulated after meals. Stone axes opened clearings and shaped posts. Children grew up in houses that left only stains in the earth. The Amazon's lost civilization was not an abstraction hidden under green. It was made of ordinary acts repeated across generations, until the ordinary became archaeological, and the archaeological became the only surviving voice. There was never one lost Amazon civilization. That may be the most important correction of all. The phrase is useful for opening the door, but once inside, the room divides into many rooms, each with its own rivers, soils, foods, languages, ceremonies, enemies, and memories. The Amazon were too large, too varied, and too old to belong to a single vanished people. What the evidence reveals is not one hidden empire waiting under the canopy, but a continent of Amazonian worlds, some connected, some separate, some rising while others declined, each finding its own way to live with water, forest, flood, and distance. Near the mouth of the Amazon, Marijo Island tells one version of the story. There, in a watery landscape shaped by channels, wetlands, tides, and seasonal change, mound-building societies created raised places for living, ceremony, and burial. Their ceramics could be elaborate, with designs and forms that suggest rich symbolic traditions and social complexity. This was not a marginal swamp occupied only because better land was unavailable. It was a productive estuarine world where people learned to build upward just enough to live with water rather than flee it. The mounds were practical, but they were also social. They lifted houses, ancestors, and memory above the flood. Far to the south and west, the Llanos de Mojos presents another Amazonian answer. There, seasonal flooding could turn broad savannas into a vast wetland, and ancient people reshaped that instability into opportunity. Raised fields, causeways, canals, and forest islands formed an engineered landscape that made food production and movement possible in a place that outsiders might have dismissed as too wet or too difficult. The people of this region were not building stone cities on dry hills. They were building with mud, water, plants, and elevation. Their world was horizontal, seasonal, and deeply technical. It required not domination over water, but fluency in it. In the upper Xingu, the pattern changes again. Here, archaeologists have found settlement clusters with plazas, roads, and earthworks that suggest planned communities linked across the landscape. Villages could be arranged around central open spaces, with roads connecting them in regional networks. The effect is not a single crowded city, but a constellation of communities, each part of a larger social field. This may have been a form of low-density urbanism, where people lived in organized settlements distributed across a managed landscape rather than packed into one dense center. Scholars still debate the exact political structure, but the evidence points toward coordination, identity, and planning on a scale far beyond isolated hamlets. In Acre and nearby regions, the geoglyphs offer yet another kind of Amazonian world. Circles, squares, and other geometric earthworks cut into the ground suggest ceremonial or public spaces whose meanings remain partly beyond reach. They may not have been cities in the usual sense. Some may not have been domestic settlements at all, but they show that people gathered, planned, and gave shape to land through geometry. Their builders invested labour in places that mattered. Even if modern scholars cannot yet fully understand why, the Amazon here appears not only as a food landscape, but as a symbolic one. Along the great whitewater rivers, another story likely unfolded. Early European accounts describe large settlements, political leaders, crowded banks, and abundant food. Archaeology has confirmed long and dense occupation in many riverine zones, though the exact scale remains debated. These were the corridors most exposed to both opportunity and catastrophe. The rivers brought fish, fertile floodplain soils, trade, travel, and communication. Later, they also brought disease, slaving raids, missions, and colonial disruption. If some of the largest Amazonian populations lived along these rivers, then some of the greatest losses may have occurred there as well, and some of the most visible evidence may have been destroyed by the rivers themselves. These worlds were not sealed apart. Rivers connected them, goods moved, ideas travelled, plants spread, pottery styles changed, people married, fought, migrated, imitated, and remembered. Yet connection does not mean uniformity. The Amazon was a web, not an empire. A person from one region might have recognized certain foods or technologies in another, while finding the rituals, languages, settlement forms, or political customs unfamiliar. This diversity makes the story harder to simplify, but also more human. Real civilizations are rarely tidy. They are mosaics of local solutions. One lesser-known but crucial detail is that language may have been one of the great hidden architectures of Amazonia. Today, the region is known for extraordinary linguistic diversity, though many languages have been lost or endangered since contact. Before the demographic disasters of the colonial period, that diversity may have been even greater. Language families spread across wide areas, while smaller languages held local histories. Movement of languages can suggest migration, trade, alliance, or prestige. But language history is difficult to match neatly with archaeology. The evidence remains incomplete. Still, it is almost certain that the ancient Amazon sounded as varied as it looked: many voices, many names for rivers, soils, plants, spirits, ancestors, and enemies. The differences among Amazonian regions also warn against one of the most common mistakes in lost civilization stories, turning complexity into a single mystery. It is tempting to ask who built the Amazonian earthworks, as if there were one answer. It is tempting to ask where the capital was, where the king lived, where the final collapse happened. But the Amazon resists that shape. Marajó was not the Upper Xingu. The Llanos de Moros was not Acre. Riverine chiefdoms were not necessarily the same as upland settlement networks. Some societies emphasized mound building, others roads, others soil enrichment, others wetland engineering, others ceremonial earthworks, and many combined several strategies at once. This variety also means that collapse did not happen in one way. A mound-building society in a flooded estuary might decline for different reasons than a road-linked network in the interior. A riverine population exposed early to epidemics might collapse rapidly, while an upland community might survive longer by retreating or reorganizing. Some regions may have experienced political change before European contact. Others may have been flourishing when the shock arrived. Climate variability, warfare, resource shifts, disease, colonial violence, and missionization all played roles, but not evenly everywhere. No single explanation fully accounts for the entire basin. That is why the Amazon's past is more like a great river system than a single road. It branches, it loops, it doubles back. One channel dries while another deepens. One region becomes a center while another becomes a margin. People move, adapt, and rework older places. The idea of a lost civilization remains useful only if it points toward this complexity rather than covering it. The Amazon was not hiding one Rome under the trees. It was hiding many Florences, many villages, many ceremonial centres, many engineered wetlands, many river societies, and many forms of life that do not fit old categories. The diversity also changes how we think about achievement. A society should not be judged less impressive because it did not build what another society built. The people of Marajo solved the problem of living in a watery estuary. The people of the Llanos de Mojos solved the problem of seasonal inundation. The communities of the Upper Singu created ordered settlement networks within forest and savanna mosaics. The builders of geoglyphs transformed Earth into public geometry. The makers of terra preta changed soil itself. These were different achievements, but none were trivial. And across them all runs a shared lesson. Amazonian civilization was often ecological in form. Its cities could be dispersed, its monuments could be low, its wealth could be alive, its roads could be earthen, its agriculture could be mixed with forest. Its collapse could leave not ruins in the ordinary sense, but altered landscapes that later generations mistook for nature alone. The differences among Amazonian cultures strengthen this lesson rather than weaken it. They show that many societies, in many environments, found ways to make the basin habitable at scales once considered impossible. The story also carries a warning for modern imagination. People often want the past to be simple enough to summarize with one name: Egypt, Rome, Maya, Inca. But even those names hide diversity, and the Amazon's diversity is more hidden still because so much was lost before it could be written down. To respect the ancient Amazon is to resist shrinking it into a single vanished empire. Its greatness lies partly in its plurality. It was not one civilization of 10 million people, but perhaps millions of people living in many civilizations, chiefdoms, towns, villages, networks, and territories, some dense and some sparse, some monumental and some subtle, all participating in a larger human transformation of the forest. What survives in the record suggests a world more difficult and more interesting than legend. There were no golden cities waiting untouched behind walls of leaves. Those popular myths are unsupported, and they distract from the real discoveries. The truth does not need gold. It has dark earth, roads, mounds, canals, geoglyphs, pottery, tree crops, and surviving indigenous knowledge. It has a forest that is not empty, and never was. The Amazon's lost worlds were powerful because they were specific. Each belonged to its own place. Each answered the land beneath it. Each left traces in a different language of earth, water, plant, and clay. Together, they form not a single missing kingdom, but a vast human archipelago spread through green. And once that is understood, the mystery becomes wider. The question is no longer where the lost civilization was. It is how many there were, how many names have vanished, and how many more still wait beneath the trees. The forest remembers in ways that are easy to miss. It does not remember as a library remembers, with dates arranged in order and names preserved exactly where they belong. It remembers through patterns. A stand of palms growing thick near an old settlement, a patch of dark earth still feeding crops centuries after its makers are gone, a raised island in a flooded plain where trees cluster above seasonal water, a path that survives as a faint corridor in vegetation, a place name carried across generations, a story about ancestors moving along a river, leaving one village, founding another, avoiding a dangerous place, returning to a mound, or honouring a bend in the water. These are not ruins in the ordinary sense, but they are not nothing. They are memory with roots. Modern indigenous communities are central to this memory. They are not footnotes to an ancient civilization, and they are not living fossils from some unchanged past. They are descendants, survivors, innovators, and guardians of knowledge shaped through both continuity and catastrophe. Their histories include deep occupation, colonial violence, mission life, displacement, resistance, adaptation, and renewal. To speak of the ancient Amazon without them would repeat the old mistake of turning inhabited land into empty scenery. The people did not vanish into myth. Many endured, even when the scale of their older worlds was broken. In some places, knowledge of old settlements, useful soils, plant groves, fishing sites, and travel routes has remained alive far longer than outside scholarship recognized. A dark earth patch may be known as good land before it is known as archaeological evidence. A mound may be part of a local landscape of memory before it appears on a scientific map. Certain trees may be protected because their value has been understood through generations. The evidence remains incomplete, and oral histories cannot always be matched neatly to archaeological layers, but they often preserve relationships to place that written colonial records ignored or distorted. The forest itself participates in that continuity. When ancient people favoured useful trees, their choices could outlive political collapse. Brazil nut trees, palms, cacao relatives, fruit trees, and medicinal plants may grow where earlier communities encouraged them. Animals spread seeds from those trees. Later people reuse the same places because the land remains productive. A settlement becomes a grove becomes a resource becomes a reason to return. In this way, human history continues moving through ecological processes long after houses disappear. What survives in the record suggests that the Amazon's present biodiversity cannot always be separated cleanly from its human past. This does not mean the forest is artificial in a simple sense. It is far too vast, dynamic, and ancient for that. But it does mean that people have been part of its ecology for millennia. They shaped species distributions, opened clearings, managed fire, improved soils, moved plants, hunted animals, created wetlands, and maintained gardens that could become forest again. The Amazon is not less natural because of this. It is more historically alive. There is a quiet reversal here. For centuries, many outsiders believed indigenous people had little history because they left few stone monuments. Now the forest shows that the monuments were often living systems. A stand of useful trees may preserve more continuity than a broken wall. A soil patch may carry more daily truth than a royal inscription. A fishing place known through practice may hold a lineage of knowledge older than many written archives. The Amazon asks history to widen its senses to read leaves, roots, soils, river levels, and human memory together. This matters because the old myth of emptiness still has modern consequences. If the Amazon is imagined as untouched wilderness without long human belonging, then indigenous land rights can be treated as recent claims rather than ancient relationships. If the forest is imagined as valuable only when humans are absent, then the people who know how to live within it are wrongly cast as threats. If ancient Amazonian achievement is ignored, modern indigenous knowledge is easier to dismiss. The archaeology of the lost Amazon is therefore not only about the past, It changes the politics of the present. One lesser-known detail is that some modern forest management practices may echo very old patterns without being exact copies of them. Swidden gardens, managed fallows, selective protection of trees, controlled burning in certain contexts, and careful harvesting can create productive mosaics that sustain both people and biodiversity. These practices have often been misunderstood as primitive or destructive when judged by outsiders unfamiliar with their timing, restraint, and ecological logic. Of course, not every burning or clearing is sustainable, and modern pressures can overwhelm traditional systems. But the ancient record shows that human use of forests does not automatically mean forest destruction. That lesson is urgent because the modern Amazon faces threats on a scale far beyond ancient land use industrial deforestation. Mining, roads, ranching, illegal logging, fires, dams, and climate stress. These forces do not resemble the slow, knowledge-rich management that created dark earth, orchards, and settlement mosaics. They tear through the land at speeds that leave little room for recovery. The discovery of ancient human influence should never be twisted into an excuse for modern destruction. The fact that people shaped the Amazon for thousands of years does not mean all forms of shaping are equal. A gardened forest is not the same as a cleared frontier. The ancient record actually strengthens the argument for protection. It shows that the forest is not empty land waiting for use, but an inhabited archive. Destroying it may erase not only species and carbon stores, but also archaeological sites, ancestral places, old soils, unrecorded earthworks, and living knowledge systems. In some regions, bulldozers and fires reveal ancient features only as they damage them. The past becomes visible at the moment of loss. That is a bitter kind of discovery. Still, the forest memory is resilient. It persists under roots, in communities, in plant distributions, in practices, in words, in foods, in river travel, and in the simple fact that people continue to live there despite centuries of efforts to remove or absorb them. The Amazon's ancient civilizations did not survive unchanged, but survival never means unchanged. Cultures adapt because they are alive. A tradition carried through disaster is not less real because it has been transformed by history. The modern rediscovery of ancient Amazonia also changes the emotional shape of the story. It is not only a tale of disappearance, it is a tale of recognition arriving late. The forest was never silent. People simply failed to understand what it was saying. The old roads were there. The dark soils were there. The tree patterns were there. Indigenous knowledge was there. The earthworks were there beneath leaves and cattle pasture and secondary growth. The problem was not only that evidence was hidden, it was that many observers were trained not to believe it. Now that belief has begun to shift, the Amazon becomes a different kind of archive. Its history is not locked in one ruined capital. It is distributed across the basin, carried by both science and living communities, archaeologists, ecologists, linguists, historians, and indigenous knowledge holders are each reading parts of the same vast text. None can read it alone. The evidence remains incomplete, and many interpretations will change, but the direction is clear. The forest remembers more than outsiders imagined. The most haunting memory may be the simplest one. People once knew these places intimately. They knew which trees would fruit after a flood, which soils could grow manioc, which channels held fish when waters fell, which mounds stayed dry, which roads led to allies, which clearings belonged to ancestors, which plants healed, poisoned, fed, or built. Much of that knowledge was damaged by conquest and disease, but not all of it disappeared. Some remains in practice. Some remains in the land. Some waits underground. To walk through the Amazon with this understanding is to feel the surface of the present become thinner. The forest is still itself vast, green, humid, alive beyond measure. But beneath its living skin lies another presence, not separate from nature but woven into it. A palm grove may be a memorial, a patch of fertile soil may be a village, a forest island may be an engineered refuge, a river bend may be a corridor of vanished trade. The past does not stand apart from the trees. It grows with them. And so the forest remembers. Not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to challenge the myth of emptiness. Enough to restore scale to the people who lived there. Enough to show that civilization can leave roots instead of ruins. Enough to remind the present that the Amazon is not a blank green wilderness, but a living historical landscape where human memory and forest life have been entangled for thousands of years. For centuries, the Amazon stood as a kind of argument. It was used to prove that some environments were too difficult for civilization. That complexity belonged only to certain climates, certain crops, certain kinds of land. It was held up as a place where human ambition failed, where nature remained in control because people could not reshape it. That argument now begins to collapse under its own weight. The evidence does not suggest that the Amazon was conquered in the way other landscapes were. It suggests something more subtle and more unsettling, that people found ways to build civilizations without breaking the forest in the ways outsiders expected. This forces a change in definition. Civilization is no longer tied so tightly to stone, metal, writing, and monumental visibility. It becomes something broader, something that can include networks of settlements, engineered soils, managed forests, wetland systems, roads, ceremonial earthworks, and social structures that leave light physical footprints but deep ecological ones. The Amazon does not fit neatly into older categories, and for a long time that meant it was excluded from them. Now it begins to reshape them. The lost Amazon is not a story of failure. It is a story of invisibility. It shows how easily human achievement can be overlooked when it does not resemble familiar forms. It shows how much knowledge can be embedded in landscapes rather than texts. It shows how a civilization can exist without announcing itself in stone. And it shows how quickly that civilization can be forgotten when catastrophe breaks continuity and outsiders arrive too late to see what once filled the space. The implications reach far beyond archaeology. They change how the present understands the forest itself. If millions of people once lived across parts of the Amazon, then the modern forest is not simply ancient wilderness. In some regions, it is a regrown landscape, shaped by abandonment as much as by deep time. That does not make it less valuable. It makes it more complex. It is both natural and historical, both ecological and cultural, both ancient and, in some ways, newly grown. There is also a warning in this. The collapse of Amazonian societies after European contact was not inevitable. It was not the result of environmental limits alone. It was driven by disease, violence, disruption, and global forces that arrived suddenly and with overwhelming effect. The lesson is not that the Amazon cannot support civilization. The lesson is that civilizations, even those deeply adapted to their environments, can be fragile when exposed to forces beyond their experience. Networks can spread not only goods and ideas, but also disaster. Knowledge can be lost in a single generation if the people who hold it are taken. And yet, not everything was lost. This is where the story turns away from disappearance and toward continuity. Indigenous peoples of the Amazon are still there. Their communities, languages, and practices have survived through centuries of pressure. They carry knowledge of rivers, soils, plants, and animals that reaches back into the deeper past, even when broken by trauma and change. The rediscovery of ancient Amazonian complexity does not create that knowledge. It reveals that it was always there, often ignored. There is a danger in telling this story as if it ends in the past, as if the lost civilization belongs only to archaeology. That would repeat the old mistake in a new form. The Amazon is not a museum. It is a living region where ancient patterns and modern realities meet. Roads, deforestation, climate change, and economic pressures now threaten both the forest and the communities that know it best. The past cannot be separated from the present because the same land is still being contested, used and changed. One lesser known but profound implication is how this changes the idea of sustainability. For a long time, sustainability has been imagined as a modern goal, something societies must learn after damaging their environments. The Amazon suggests that some societies developed long-term relationships with their landscapes that balanced use and regeneration, not perfectly, not without conflict, but effectively enough to support large populations over long periods. Terra preta, managed forests. Wetland engineering and diversified food systems all point to strategies that worked within environmental limits rather than ignoring them. They're not blueprints to copy directly, but they challenge the assumption that large human populations must always degrade their surroundings in the same way. At the same time, the ancient record is not a simple model of harmony. There were conflicts, inequalities, and changes. Some systems may have failed even before European contact. Some landscapes may have been stressed. The evidence remains incomplete. No single explanation fully accounts for how each region rose and changed, but the presence of complexity itself is enough to overturn the older dismissal. The Amazon was not an exception to human history. It was part of it. The idea of 10 million people remains a powerful symbol in this story. Whether the exact number rises or falls with future research, it represents a scale that can no longer be ignored. It forces the imagination to populate the forest with life villages, networks, ceremonies, labor, conflict, knowledge, and memory. It makes the silence of the modern forest more difficult to accept as original. It restores the sense that something vast once moved there, something that left traces subtle enough to be missed and strong enough to be found again. The rediscovery of that scale also changes the emotional tone of the Amazon. It is no longer only a place of untouched beauty or distant wilderness. It becomes a place of lost conversations, broken networks, and interrupted histories. The rivers still flow, but they once carried more voices. The forest still grows, but it once grew around many more hands. The soil still feeds, but it was once fed by lives now absent. The Amazon becomes not only a natural wonder, but a human absence layered into green. And yet, even absence is not complete. The forest does not hold only ghosts. It holds continuity in altered forms. The descendants of those ancient societies remain, even if their numbers, territories, and ways of life have been transformed. The knowledge of how to live in the Amazon did not disappear entirely. It adapted, it hid, it survived where it could. The lost civilization is not entirely lost. It is partly remembered, partly buried, partly growing, and partly still alive. In the end, the Amazon does not offer a single answer. It offers a challenge. It asks whether civilization must always be loud to be real, whether history must always be visible to be acknowledged, whether the absence of familiar ruins is proof of absence or simply a failure of recognition. It asks us to reconsider what counts as evidence, what counts as achievement, and what kinds of worlds we are willing to see. The forest stands as it always has, immense and alive, but it is no longer silent. Beneath the canopy, in the soil, in the patterns of trees, in the shapes revealed from the air, and in the knowledge carried by those who still live there, another Amazon is present. It is not a myth. It is not a legend of golden cities. It is a human world that once filled the basin in ways only now becoming visible. And once seen, it cannot be unseen. The empty wilderness dissolves. In its place stands a different vision, a forest that is also a civilization, a landscape that is also an archive, and a past that waited, not for discovery, but for recognition. The green canopy closes again, as it always does, but now it feels different, not like a barrier, but like a veil drawn over something still there. The rivers move through it with the same slow certainty, bending around islands, carrying sediment, reflecting light. From above, nothing announces the millions who once lived here. There are no towers piercing the leaves, no walls casting long shadows. The forest appears complete in itself, but the longer one listens, the harder it is to believe in that completeness. Because beneath the surface, the traces remain, not as ruins waiting in open air, but as quiet alterations, soil darkened by generations of life, trees standing where people once planted or protected them, roads softened into lines that only certain light or certain instruments can reveal, mounds rising just enough to stay dry through a flood, places where the ground still grows better crops because of decisions made centuries ago. It is a different kind of memory, not preserved by design, but by persistence. And that memory carries a strange kind of calm. The Amazon does not rush to explain itself. It does not display its history easily. It lets the past settle into the present until the two become difficult to separate. The living forest and the lost world share the same space, layered so closely that one can pass through without realizing what is underfoot. That may be the most enduring image of all. Not a vanished city, not a final moment of collapse, but a landscape continuing, leaves falling onto old ground, roots growing through ancient paths, water rising and falling as it always has, and somewhere in that rhythm, the echo of millions of lives that shaped the forest without breaking it, and then disappeared from view without truly disappearing from the land. The Amazon remains vast, but it is no longer empty. It is full of time,